Deep beneath the mountains, in places where the stone holds memories older than kingdoms, there are echoes that have not been heard for an age. In the great dwarf halls of Khazad-dûm, silence had settled like dust, and the songs of the ancestors had faded to whispers. But sometimes, all it takes is one curious soul to listen a little closer, to believe that what has been lost might still be found. This is the story of Kalin, a young bellmaker who heard something no one else could, a resonance hidden in the depths, a call that would change not only his life, but the fate of his entire people. We'd love to know where you're listening from right now, whether you're nestled somewhere quiet as evening falls or tuning in with the morning light. Let us know in the comments below what time it is where you are, and what drew you into this tale of forgotten echoes and reclaimed heritage. There's something powerful about sharing stories across distances and times, and tonight, we journey together into the heart of a legend. Kalin was not a hero in the traditional sense, not yet. He was a dreamer, a craftsman with hands skilled in shaping metal, and a heart attuned to the older magics of his people. While others in his clan had accepted the silence, he could not let go of the stories his grandfather once told, of great bells whose vibrations could heal the mountain, summon the dawn, or even speak with those long gone. And then, one day, in a forgotten forge tucked away in a disused chamber, he heard it, a faint, persistent hum, a resonance that should not have been there. It was a thread of sound, thin but unbroken, pulling him toward a truth others feared to uncover. His elders warned him of guardians left to slumber, of dangers best left undisturbed. But Kaelen believed that some silences are not meant to be kept, that in restoring the echoes of the past, we rediscover who we are meant to be. Deep within the stone heart of the mountain, far from the familiar workshops and living quarters, lay the sealed archives, a place of dust, shadows, and forgotten knowledge. The air here was still and heavy, thick with the scent of aged parchment and cold rock. Kaelen moved with a cautious reverence, the beam of his luminescent fungus lamp cutting a solitary path through the darkness. Towering shelves, carved directly into the cavern walls, groaned under the weight of countless stone tablets and brittle scrolls, each one a silent testament to a history his people had chosen to overlook. This was not a place for idle curiosity. It was a vault of last resort, and every step he took felt like a trespass against the warnings of his elders. Yet, the faint hum he discovered in the old forge was a compass in his mind, pulling him deeper into the silence, insisting that answers lay buried here. His goal was a specific section, mentioned only in fragmented family stories, the Chronicle of Resonance, a collection of records dedicated entirely to the art and science of the great bellmakers. Finding it was a task of patience and intuition. He ran his fingers over the cool stone of the tablets, feeling the intricate grooves of runes carved by hands centuries gone. The language was archaic, a dialect of Dwarvish that used complex harmonic symbols alongside more common lettering, designed to be read not just with the eyes, but with an understanding of sound. Kaelin's training as a bellmaker gave him the key. He would whisper the runes aloud, listening for the subtle vibration they created in the air, a vibration that sometimes revealed hidden meanings or unlocked complementary inscriptions on adjacent stones. It was a slow, painstaking process, a conversation with ghosts. After what felt like an age of searching, His light fell upon a massive, obsidian slab, darker than the surrounding rock. This was it. The runes here were not carved, but inlaid with a faintly glowing mithril, and they depicted not just text, but musical staves and intricate diagrams of cavern systems. His heart hammered against his ribs as he began to decipher the story they told. It spoke of the great Bell of Durin, not as mere legend, but as a tangible creation. It described its founding in a star metal alloy, its casting in a forge fueled by the breath of the mountain itself, and its purpose, to act as the heart of Khazad-dûm, its song harmonizing with the natural frequencies of the stone to promote growth, healing, and connection. But the runes also held a warning, a dire prophecy that the bell's silence would bring not just quiet, but a slow withering of the Dwarven spirit, a disconnection from their own identity. The most crucial part was a series of interlocking symbols that formed a map. It was not a map of physical tunnels, but a harmonic one. It indicated that the bell was hidden in a chamber known as the root of the mountain, a place that could only be found by following a specific sequence of resonant frequencies through the deepest, most unstable halls. To Kalin, this was not a deterrent, it was a revelation. It was the proof he needed. In his excitement, he reached out to trace the final, glowing rune, his voice rising slightly as he sounded out the key harmonic sequence. The moment his finger made contact, the mithril flared with a soft blue light. A low, resonant tone pulsed through the archive, a silent alarm that traveled not through the air, but through the very stone of the mountain itself. High above, in the well-lit chambers of the Elder Council, the tremor was felt, not heard. Elder Boren, a dwarf whose long white beard was woven with beads of office, and whose face was a roadmap of deep concerns, paused mid-sentence during a meeting on grain storage. He placed a broad, calloused hand flat upon the stone table, feeling the faint but unmistakable vibration. His eyes, sharp and weary, met those of the other elders. They all knew there was only one thing in the deep places that could generate that specific frequency. Without a word, Boren rose, his expression a storm of anger and profound fear. Someone had breached the archives. Someone was stirring echoes that were meant to sleep forever, and in doing so, they risked awakening the stone Sentinel guardians, ancient, powerful spirits left to stand vigil over the mistakes of the past. Kaelen, alone with his discovery, had no idea that his quest for light had just cast a very long and very dangerous shadow. The discovery in the archives was a map, but it was useless without the right key. Kaelen understood that the Great Bell was not hidden behind a physical door, but behind a song, and to reach it, he would need a tool capable of singing that song into the stone. A common forge hammer would not do. He needed an instrument of precision, a tuning hammer forged from metals that remembered the old harmonies. He retreated not to the main clan forges, where he would be seen and questioned, but to the very same forgotten chamber where his journey had begun. This small, dusty workshop, tucked away in a disused air vent, became his sanctuary and his laboratory. Here, surrounded by the ghosts of Bellmakers past, he began his most delicate work. The materials he sought were not stored on any shelf. They were heirlooms, fragments of a legacy his people had let fade. From a hidden crevice, he retrieved a small, worn chest that had belonged to his grandfather. Inside, wrapped in soft linen, were the metals of memory, a sliver of true silver from the first anvil of Khazad-dûm, a nugget of iron ore that had fallen from a star, and a twist of copper that had once been part of the great resonant coil in the Hall of Song. Individually, they were precious relics. Together, they were the ingredients for a key. To combine them, he would need to employ a forgotten technique known as harmonic binding, a process where the metals are not merely melted together, but are persuaded to merge their resonant frequencies through carefully applied heat and precisely timed strikes. The forging itself was a solitary symphony of fire and focus. Each stage was a test of his skill and his spirit. Heating the metals required a fire not just of coal, but of certain singing crystals that amplified the heat's frequency. The bellows were his own breath, controlled and steady, as he had to hum a specific, low-frequency note to keep the flames at the exact right pitch. When the metals glowed with a light that seemed to come from within, he began to work them. The first strike of his preliminary hammer against the glowing composite sent a shockwave of pure, clear tone through the small chamber, a note so pure it made the stone walls hum in sympathy. It was working, but with each subsequent strike, the challenge grew. The metals, each with their own ancient song, resisted a perfect union. His arm ached with the effort of controlling the force and angle of every blow. His mind strained to maintain the precise harmonic focus needed to bind them. This was more than smithing. It was a conversation with the very soul of the mountain, a plea to the ancestors to lend their strength to his purpose. Finally, the hammer took shape in the cooling trough. It was a crude, beautiful thing. The head was a mottled blend of the three metals, and the haft was a piece of heartwood from an ancient, petrified oak that grew in the upper halls. It felt alive in his hands, humming with a potential that was both thrilling and terrifying. He knew he had to test it. Holding the hammer aloft, he chose a small, dormant tuning plate embedded in the chamber wall, a relic used by apprentices long ago. He took a deep breath, focused his intent on a single, clear note of awakening, and struck. The sound that rang out was not the pure, clean tone he had hoped for. It was close, achingly close, but flawed. A faint dissonance shivered at the edge of the note, a jarring harmonic irregularity that spoke of his own imperfect skill and the rushed nature of his work. It was the sound of good intentions not quite meeting mastery. That flawed note did not fade into silence. Instead, the dissonance, that tiny sliver of sonic imperfection, was absorbed by the stone. The mountain, a perfect conductor of sound, carried it downward, amplifying its jagged edge as it traveled into the deepest, darkest tunnels, places no dwarf had walked in centuries. The vibration traveled through seams of crystal and pools of stagnant water, through caverns vast and empty, and passages narrow as a whisper, and in one such lightless depth, the vibration found something that was waiting. It was not a sound that thing had felt in an age. The dissonance was an irritation, a scratch upon a silence it was sworn to keep. A shift occurred in the absolute blackness, a slow, grinding movement of stone against stone that was not a natural settling of the earth. It was the sound of attention being paid. Far above, clutching his imperfect tool, Kalin felt a sudden, profound chill that had nothing to do with the cold air of the chamber. The silence around him felt different now. It felt like it was listening back. The confrontation was not long in coming. Kaelen had barely returned to his small living quarters, the newly forged hammer feeling heavier than its weight in his hands, when a shadow fell across his doorway. Elder Boren stood there, his broad frame blocking the light from the corridor, his expression a grim mask of disappointment and deep-seated fear. He did not need to ask what Kaelen had been doing. The faint, lingering scent of star metal and the resonant energy still clinging to the young dwarf were evidence enough. Boren stepped inside without an invitation, the door closing with a soft, final thud behind him. The silence in the small room was thick and heavy, broken only by the distant, steady drip of water from a seep in the rock wall. Boren's voice, when he finally spoke, was low and gravelly, devoid of its usual council hall authority, and filled instead with a weary dread. "You feel it now, don't you?" he said, his eyes fixed not on Kaelen, but on the stone floor, as if he could see through it into the depths below. "The change in the silence. You have put a crack in it, and now something from the other side is looking in." He explained that the halls of Khazad-dûm were never truly empty. After the great silence fell, the ancient Bellmakers, in their final act, had not just abandoned their work, they had set guardians. These were not living creatures, but stone sentinel spirits, beings woven from the very essence of the mountain's memory and grief. They were tasked with one duty: to ensure that the deep magic of the bells would never be disturbed again, to prevent the pride and folly that had first broken the harmony from ever happening again. They were the mountain's immune system, and Kaelin's dissonant strike had been perceived as a poison, an infection they were now awakening to purge. The archives, the vibrations. "You tread on ground that is not just stone, but sorrow," Boren continued, his tone becoming more urgent. "Every attempt in the past to reclaim what was lost has only ended in greater loss. Good dwarves, curious and brave like you, have ventured down and never returned. Their fate is a warning etched not in runes, but in the quiet dread of every elder who has ever felt the mountain tremble with an anger that is not its own." He pleaded with Kaelen to see reason, to understand that his passion, however noble, was a danger to himself and to the entire clan. The path he was on led only to awakening a wrath that could bring the very ceilings down upon them all. To continue was the height of recklessness. Kaelen stood his ground, the weight of the elder's words pressing on him almost physically. He could feel the truth in Boren's fear. The chilling presence he'd felt after his hammer strike was confirmation enough. But where Boren saw only a threat, Kaelen still saw a sliver of hope. The Sentinels were not mere monsters. They were protectors of the very thing he sought to restore. They were a response to a broken song. What if the answer wasn't to avoid them, but to understand them, to speak to them in a language they had not heard in an age, the language of perfect, healing harmony? Abandoning his quest now would mean accepting that the heart of his people was forever broken, that their greatest achievements were forever locked away as forbidden secrets. He could not live with that silence. Seeing the unwavering resolve in the young dwarf's eyes, Elder Boren let out a long, slow breath, the fight seeming to drain out of him. He realized that mere forbidding would not work. This fire would not be so easily extinguished. With a reluctant, almost reluctant gesture, he offered a different path, a thread of possibility woven from old, half-remembered gossip and the records of those past failed expeditions. "If you will not turn back," Boren said, his voice barely a whisper, "then you cannot go forward alone. Your crude tool and your solitary courage are not enough. You need knowledge that the clan has turned from. There is another, one who studied these paths long before you, who believed as you do, and who paid the price for it. He spoke a name that was spoken rarely in the clan, and only in hushed, disapproving tones. Lyra, once a brilliant lore keeper, she had become obsessed with the theoretical magic of echoes, believing they could be mapped and understood. Her methods were deemed unnatural, a dangerous meddling with forces best left alone. Her final experiment, an attempt to capture a fading echo in the lower halls, had allegedly caused a minor rockfall. No one was hurt, but the incident was the last straw. She was exiled from the inner circles of keepers, her reputation shattered, and now she lived as a recluse on the outskirts of the dwelling halls, tending to the fungal gardens and speaking to almost no one. Boren made it clear that he offered this not as a blessing, but as a grim necessity. She is the only one who might understand what you are trying to do. And she is the only one who might be fool enough to help you. The choice is yours, Kalin. Abandon this madness, or go and seek out another who dwells within it. With that, the elder turned and left, leaving Kaelen standing alone at a crossroads, not between right and wrong, but between fear and faith, with the name of an exiled believer echoing in the new silence. The path to Lyra's dwelling was a journey into the forgotten edges of the clan's territory. Kaelen moved through corridors that were less maintained, where the glow moss was thin, and the air carried the damp, earthy scent of the deep fungal gardens she now tended. This was a place of quiet exile, where the sounds of the main forges and bustling halls were just a distant murmur, a constant reminder of the community she had been pushed away from. He found her not in a workshop or library, but on her knees in a cavern where luminous fungi of blue and soft gold grew in intricate, patterned rows. She was humming a low, complex tune to a patch of particularly vibrant mushrooms, her hands gently brushing their caps as if coaxing a secret from them. She did not look up as he approached, but the slight tightening of her shoulders told him she was aware of his presence. The silence that hung between them was different from the archive's dusty stillness or the forge's anticipatory quiet. This was a silence of defense, of walls carefully built and maintained. When he finally spoke her name, his voice felt too loud in the hushed grotto. She slowly rose, turning to face him, and he saw a face that was younger than the stories suggested, but aged by a deep, resigned weariness. Her eyes, a sharp gray that seemed to see everything at once, held no welcome, only a guarded curiosity. He began to explain, his words tumbling out in a rush. The hum in the old forge, the discovery in the archives, the forging of the hammer, the warning from Elder Boren. He spoke of the Great Bell and the harmonic map, of his belief that the song of their people could be reawakened. As he talked, her expression did not soften. If anything, it grew more closed, more skeptical. She listened not like someone hearing a grand revelation, but like a scholar identifying the flaws in a poorly constructed theory. When he finished, her response was not a refusal, but a dissection. "You heard a hum," she stated, her voice flat. "You found some runes. You made a hammer that sang a flawed note and woke the sentinels, and now you believe you are the one to fix it all." She gestured around the fungal garden. "This is what remains of my work. I, too, believed I could listen to the mountain. I devised crystals that could capture the faintest whisper of an echo, to study its structure, to learn its language. I thought understanding was the first step to healing." A shadow passed over her face, the memory of that failure as fresh as if it were yesterday. One misaligned frequency, one note a fraction too sharp, and the mountain answered. Not with a song, but with a roar. The rockfall was small, but the consequence was absolute. They called it reckless meddling. They were right. She saw in him not a kindred spirit, but a mirror of her own past naivety, a ghost of the ambition that had cost her everything. He was proposing to walk the very path that had broken her, armed with even less preparation, and a tool he admitted was imperfect. To her, it wasn't a quest. It was a suicide mission that would likely get them both killed, and only further cement the clan's fear of the old ways. Her skepticism was a shield forged in the fires of her own humiliation and loss. Why would she leave the relative peace of her exile to chase another dwarf's dream, especially one that echoed her own greatest failure? Kaelin's answer did not come from a place of argument, but from a place of shared understanding. He did not try to dismiss her fears or minimize her past. Instead, he acknowledged it. They were wrong to exile you, he said, his voice quieter now, filled with a conviction that went beyond his own desire. Not because your experiment didn't fail, but because they punished the attempt. They fear the echo because they only remember the silence that followed the crash. They don't remember the music that came before. He held up his makeshift hammer, its flawed form a testament to his own limitations. I don't have your knowledge. I have a map I barely understand and a tool that isn't good enough. I will fail on my own, but you know what not to do. You understand the theory. You speak the language of echoes. This isn't about proving the elders wrong. It's about proving that we were right to listen in the first place. He was not asking her to follow him. He was asking her to lead. He was offering her not just a chance at redemption, but a validation of her life's work. He was handing her the fragments of his discovery and admitting that without her, they were just pieces of a puzzle he couldn't solve. The weight of his belief, the raw honesty of his admission, began to crack the ice of her skepticism. She looked from his earnest face to the crude hammer, and then past him, into the shadows of the tunnels that led down. The silence there seemed to pulse, waiting. Her past failure was a heavy chain, but the prospect of letting this one chance slip away, of living the rest of her life, wondering what if, felt even heavier. With a slow, deliberate breath that seemed to carry the weight of her decision, she gave a single, sharp nod. They will be watching the main descent, she said, her tone shifting from that of a recluse to that of a strategist. We will need to use the old service conduits. They are unstable and rarely patrolled. Gather what supplies you can carry. We leave before the next watch cycle. The partnership was forged not in confidence, but in a shared, grim determination, a pact between two dwarves who had nothing left to lose but their silence. The service conduits were a tight, winding maze of neglect, a world away from the broad, well-lit avenues of the main clan holdings. Kaelen and Lyra moved in single file, the air thick with the smell of damp stone and the faint, sweet rot of old fungus. The only light came from the pale blue glow of the luminescent moss clinging to the walls, casting their shadows into long, dancing shapes that seemed to flee ahead of them. The silence here was different too. It was a pressurized quiet, broken only by the scuff of their boots on grit and the occasional, distant groan of the mountain settling around them. It was in this tense, claustrophobic passage that Lyra finally stopped, holding up a hand. She pressed her palm flat against the cold rock of the wall, her eyes closed in concentration. "Listen," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Do you feel that?" Kalin mimicked her, placing his own hand on the stone. After a moment, he felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration, a steady, rhythmic hum that seemed to emanate from deep within the earth itself. "The bridge," Lyra said, opening her eyes. "It's singing its stress. We're close." The tunnel opened abruptly onto a sight that stole the breath from Kalen's lungs. They stood at the edge of a vast, black chasm, so deep the bottom was lost in an abyss of shadow. Spanning this terrifying gap was a structure of breathtaking beauty and terrifying fragility, the Bridge of Echoes. It was not built of brick or mortared stone, but appeared to be a single, sweeping arch of natural crystal and obsidian, woven together like a delicate lacework of glass and night. It had no railings, no supports, its surface worn smooth by time and the passage of elements no longer present, and it was, as Lyra had sensed, humming. The entire structure vibrated with a complex, layered frequency, a song of immense strain and ancient power. Every gust of air from the abyss below, every subtle shift in the mountain's pressure, made the bridge's tone waver and change. It was an instrument of impossible size, and they were being asked to play it with their feet. "This is it," Lyra stated, her voice clinical despite the awe-inspiring vista. "The first guardian. It doesn't need sentinels. It defends itself." She explained the principle quickly, her words efficient. The bridge's structure was perfectly tuned to a specific resonant frequency. Any external vibration that did not match its natural harmonic pattern would be absorbed and amplified, feeding energy into the structure until it reached a catastrophic point. A footstep in the wrong rhythm, a voice raised too high, even the heavy beat of a fearful heart could, in theory, add to the destructive energy. The wrong step wouldn't just cause a collapse, it would make the bridge shatter itself from the inside out with the force of their own misplaced energy. Crossing it required more than bravery, it required perfect acoustic balance. Kaelen looked from the terrifying span to Lyra, his own confidence faltering before the sheer physics of the challenge. But Lyra was already at work, her earlier skepticism replaced by a focused intensity. She knelt at the bridge's entrance, pulling a small, tuning fork of polished bronze from her pack. She struck it softly against her knee, producing a pure, quiet tone, and held it close to the bridge's surface. She listened, her head cocked, as the bridge's hum interacted with the fork's note. She repeated the process at several points, her brow furrowed in concentration, mapping the sonic landscape of their path. "It's a sequence," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "A walking melody. The frequency shifts slightly every 7 steps. We must match our pace to its song, not too slow, or we dampen the vibration and create a dead spot. Not too fast, or we overstimulate it. We have to harmonize with it." She turned to Kaelen, her gray eyes sharp and clear. "You must do exactly as I do. Place your feet where I place mine. Breathe when I breathe. My steps will set the tempo. You must be my perfect echo, one beat behind. Your weight, your movement, must be a mirror of my own, or we will create a dissonance the bridge cannot tolerate. Do you understand? There was no room for error, no margin for independent action. His trust in her had to be absolute, a surrender of his own will to her expertise. He nodded, his throat too dry to speak. Lyra took a final, steadying breath, focused her gaze on a point on the far side of the chasm, and took the first step onto the glassy surface. The bridge responded immediately. The hum beneath their feet intensified, rising in pitch as it accepted the new weight. Lyra moved not with the cautious, creeping gait of someone afraid of falling, but with the smooth, rolling pace of a dancer following a complex rhythm. She would pause for a moment after a certain number of steps, feeling the vibration through her soles before continuing. Kalin followed, his entire world narrowing to the spot where her boot had just been. He matched her stride length exactly, his muscles aching with the control required to replicate her precise pressure and timing. The abyss yawned beneath them, a silent, hungry mouth, but the immediate danger was the song vibrating up through their bones. One misstep would be a wrong note in a symphony that demanded perfection. Halfway across, the bridge's song changed. A sudden updraft from the chasm below swept over them, causing the entire structure to let out a low, ominous moan. The vibration underfoot became a jarring shudder. Kaelen faltered, his next step landing a fraction of a second too late, and with a jarring force. The bridge answered with a sharp, cracking sound, like ice breaking over a deep lake. A web of thin fractures appeared in the crystalline surface to his right. Panic, a cold and immediate terror, seized him. This was it. This was how they failed. But before the fear could root itself, Lyra's voice cut through the dissonance, not shouting, but singing. It was a single, sustained note, low and resonant, a perfect counter to the bridge's distress. She held the note, her body perfectly still, and slowly, deliberately, placed her next step with exaggerated care. The fractures did not spread, the shuddering calmed. She had not commanded the bridge, she had conversed with it, offering a harmonic solution to their shared discord. In that moment, Kaelen saw not a disgraced scholar, but a master of her craft. He followed her lead, his breath catching in his chest, and they finished the crossing in a tense, silent ballet. When Lyra's final step landed on the solid rock of the far ledge, she immediately turned and offered Kaelen her hand, pulling him the last step to safety. They stood there for a long moment, both breathing heavily, the terrifying span of the bridge behind them. The shared peril had dissolved the last remnants of formal distance between them. They were no longer a hopeful novice and a skeptical expert. They were partners who had just entrusted their lives to one another's skill. Kaelen looked at Lyra, really looked at her, seeing the focused intensity in her eyes and the slight tremor of adrenaline in her hands. "You saved us," he said, his voice filled with a newfound respect that went far beyond gratitude. Lyra managed a small, tired smile, the first genuine one he had seen from her. "We saved us," she corrected him softly. "You listened, and you followed. That is a rare thing." The bridge of stone was behind them, but a far more important bridge of trust had been solidly built in its place, strong enough to bear the weight of whatever lay ahead. Beyond the bridge of echoes, the air itself seemed to change. The damp, mineral scent of the main tunnels gave way to something drier, almost electric, like the air after a lightning strike. The passage they followed began to widen, its walls smoothing out from rough-hewn rock to polished stone, veined with threads of crystal that caught their faint light and refracted it into 1,000 tiny, dancing stars. a new sound gradually layered over their own breathing and footsteps, so subtle at first that Kalin thought it was a trick of the mind, a ringing in his ears from the tension. But as they moved forward, it grew clearer. It was not one sound, but many, a faint, ethereal chorus of high, pure notes that seemed to have no source, hanging in the air like mist. Lyra stopped, holding up a hand, her head tilted. Her eyes, which had been so full of practical focus at the bridge, now held a look of pure, unadulterated wonder. "Do you hear that?" she breathed, her voice filled with a reverence Kaelen had never heard from her before. "It can't be. It's the Chamber of Whispers. I thought it was only a legend." They stepped through a final, arched opening and into a cavern that stole all words away. The chamber was vast and circular, its domed ceiling lost in shadow. The walls were not merely veined with crystal, they were made of it, great geodes of amethyst and clear quartz that erupted from the floor and reached for the ceiling, humming with an internal energy. And the sound was everywhere. It was the ghost of a grand symphony, the lingering memory of a music so powerful that its echo had refused to die. Faint, shimmering melodies wove around each other, fragments of ancient bell songs that had been sung into the stone ages ago. You could almost catch a tune, a recognizable sequence of notes from a festival carillon or a funeral dirge. But before your mind could fully grasp it, it would dissolve back into the beautiful, haunting noise. This was no mere acoustic phenomenon. It was a library of sound, an archive of every significant note ever played in the deep halls, preserved forever in the unique resonant properties of the chamber's crystal matrix. Lyra moved through the space as if in a trance, her hands held out slightly, as if she could feel the vibrations on her skin. The text spoke of this, she whispered, her voice hushed with awe. They said the great Bellmakers would come here to listen, to learn from the songs of the past. It was said that a master could find the solution to any harmonic problem hidden within these whispers. For her, this was not just a discovery, it was the physical proof of a lifetime of study, the validation of every theory for which she had been scorned. She pointed to the largest of the amethyst clusters. The resonance is strongest there. The crystal acts as a natural amplifier and storage device. The songs aren't just bouncing around, they're held there. Kaelen, though equally mesmerized, saw something more immediate. The harmonic map from the archives had been a set of instructions, but here was the source material. If they could capture even a fragment of this music, it could be the key to understanding the sequence needed to find the Great Bell. He remembered the tool he had brought for just such a possibility, though he had never truly believed he would have a use for it. From his pack, he carefully withdrew a recording crystal, a palm-sized, multifaceted quartz sphere housed in a copper wire cradle. It was a simple device, one used by apprentices to capture the tone of a new bell for study. The principle was straightforward. The crystal, when struck by sound waves, would temporarily align its internal structure to mimic the frequency, holding the memory of the sound until it was tapped against a resonating plate to play it back. It was a tool for a workshop, not for a place of legendary power. With a look of excited determination, he approached the large amethyst cluster. The air around it thrummed with the most complex and beautiful layers of sound. This was it. This was the heart of the chorus. He held up the recording crystal, his hand trembling slightly with anticipation and the sheer force of the vibrations. Lyra, pulled from her reverie, watched him with a sudden flicker of concern. "Kalin, wait," she said, her scholarly mind engaging the energy here. "It's ancient, it's layered. That crystal is designed for a single, pure note. We don't know what capturing such a complex harmony might do." But her warning came a moment too late. He had already pressed the recording sphere against the humming face of the amethyst. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. The crystal did not simply record the sound, it acted like a drain. The myriad whispering echoes, the beautiful, chaotic harmony of centuries, suddenly had a focal point. They funneled into the small sphere with a force that was almost visible, a torrent of sonic energy that made the recording crystal flare with a blinding white light and let out a high, piercing shriek. For a single, terrifying second, the chamber of whispers fell utterly, profoundly silent. The ancient music was gone, sucked into the apprentice's tool. Then, the recording crystal, overwhelmed by energy it was never meant to contain, shattered into a million dust-like fragments. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. It was a vacuum, and then, from the far end of the chamber, where the shadows were deepest, that vacuum was filled. A new sound emerged, a low, grinding vibration that was the absolute opposite of the beautiful whispers. It was the sound of stone being dragged against stone, of deep, resonant anger. A form began to pull itself from the largest geode, not walking, but unfolding. It was humanoid in shape, but constructed of solidified sound layers of compressed, visible air and crystalline dust that shimmered with a distorted, angry light. Its form flickered with jagged, dissonant harmonics, the echoes of the beautiful music it was meant to guard, now twisted into a weapon. It had no face, only a focused intention, and that intention was fixed entirely on the two dwarves who had violated the silence. This was no stone sentinel from a story. This was an echo guardian, a being of pure sonic energy, awakened from its dormant state by Kaelin's clumsy attempt to steal the very thing it was created to protect. The guardian did not roar. It let out a pulse of pure force, a wave of compressed air that hit them like a physical blow, knocking them off their feet and sending them sliding backward across the smooth floor. Lyra was the first to scramble up, her face pale, but her mind already racing. "It's a resonance entity," she yelled over the growing, dissonant hum that now filled the chamber, drowning out the returning, fainter whispers. "It's made of the very sound it guards. We can't fight it. We have to go." The guardian took a first, ground-shaking step toward them, its form rippling with destructive potential. Their moment of wonder was over. The chase had begun. Panic was a cold fire in their veins as they fled the chamber of whispers, the dissonant hum of the guardian pulsing against their backs like a physical pressure. The beautiful, haunting melodies were gone, replaced by the grinding, angry resonance of their pursuer. They scrambled into a narrow, unadorned passageway, a service tunnel not meant for grand processions, its walls rough and close. The tight space, which should have offered a sliver of protection, instead became a trap. A deep, shuddering vibration shook dust from the ceiling, and the guardian filled the entrance behind them, its form of solidified sound rippling and shifting to fit the confines of the tunnel. It did not need to squeeze through. It simply flowed, a tidal wave of malevolent noise contained within stone walls. Its flickering, light distorting presence, cutting off any hope of retreat. They were cornered, with nothing but dead end and cold rock ahead. Lyra pressed herself against the wall, her eyes wide not just with fear, but with a scholar's frantic analysis. "It's adapting," she shouted over the rising din. "Its frequency is syncing with the tunnel's natural resonant. It's using the stone to amplify itself." The entity was learning, turning their environment into a weapon. The very air began to thicken, pressing in on their ears and chests with a force that made it hard to breathe. Each pulse from the Guardian felt like a hammer blow to the senses, a disorienting wave of sonic pressure that threatened to overwhelm their thoughts and reduce them to helplessness. Kalen's mind raced, his own terror screaming at him to shut down, to accept the inevitable, but his hands, acting on an instinct deeper than fear, closed around the haft of his tuning hammer. It was a tool for creation, for bringing order and beauty to sound. Now he had to ask it to do the opposite. He remembered the principle from his earliest apprenticeship. For every frequency, there is an opposing frequency, a counter vibration that can cancel it out. It was the foundation of harmonic dampening, used to calm an overly resonant bell or silence a vibrating anvil. But this was no simple bell. This was a chaotic, intelligent storm of sound. He had no time for calculation, no chance for precision. It was a desperate gamble. As the Guardian drew closer, its form coalescing into a sharper, more threatening shape, Kalin raised the imperfect hammer. He didn't aim for the entity itself. How does one strike solidified air? Instead, he turned and slammed the head of the hammer against the tunnel wall beside him. He put all his focus, all his remaining hope, into a single intent, not a note of power, but a note of negation. He didn't try to match the Guardian's complex, angry dissonance. Instead, he sought its fundamental root, the core vibration underpinning the chaos. The hammer struck the stone with a loud crack, but the sound that followed was not the clear tone he had produced in the forge. It was a raw, jagged burst of sonic energy, a blunt force vibration that was the acoustic equivalent of a shout, trying to silence a scream. It was ugly. It was clumsy, but it was also direct. The effect was immediate and violent. The two frequencies, the Guardian's complex wave and Kalen's crude counterpulse, collided in the narrow space. The air itself seemed to warp, shimmering with visible interference patterns, before erupting in a concussive thump of silent force that threw both dwarves to the ground. The Echo Guardian did not scream, it distorted. Its form, so menacingly solid a moment before, fragmented like a reflection in a shattered mirror. The coherent, angry light that defined it broke apart into 100 shimmering, disconnected shards of sound that whirled chaotically through the passage, ricocheting off the walls in a cacophony of conflicting notes. It wasn't destroyed, but it was utterly, completely disoriented, its consciousness scrambled by the sonic backlash. The way was clear. "Now, go," Lyra yelled, already scrambling to her feet. They didn't need to be told twice. They stumbled past the whirling, confused storm of dissonant energy, fleeing down the tunnel as the disoriented Guardian tried and failed to pull its scattered form back together. They ran until the terrible sound faded behind them, finally collapsing against a wall in a small, dark antechamber, their chests heaving, ears ringing in the newfound silence. It was only then, in the dim light, that Kalin looked down at the tool that had saved them. The star metal head of the hammer was now marred by a deep, jagged crack that ran through the mithril inlay. The once potent hum he felt when holding it was gone, replaced by a faint, irregular buzz, like a songbird with a broken wing. The sacrifice for their escape was etched into the very metal of his hope. The key was damaged, and the locks ahead were still many. The silence of the antechamber was a fragile thing, broken only by their ragged breathing and the faint, irregular buzz from the cracked hammer in Kalen's hand. He stared at the damaged tool, a sinking feeling in his gut. It had been their only key, and now it was nearly broken. Lyra, however, was not looking at the hammer. Her gaze was turned back down the dark tunnel from which they'd fled, her head slightly tilted, as if she were still listening to the dissonant chaos they had left behind. The raw, academic curiosity that had defined her was now tempered by a grim, first-hand understanding. "It wasn't just trying to stop us," she said, her voice low and thoughtful, pulling Kalin from his despair. "It was reacting. It was designed to." She turned to him, her gray eyes intense in the dim light. "The texts I studied, the ones they called heretical. They weren't just about capturing echoes. They were about understanding the safeguards. The Guardians weren't created as mindless destroyers. They were the last, desperate measure of the ancient Bellmakers." She explained that in the time before the Great Silence, the power of the bells was not just for ceremony or communication. It could reshape stone, guide growth, heal fissures in the mountain's heart, and even influence thought and emotion. It was a fundamental force, as potent and dangerous as any volcano or earthquake, and like any great power, it attracted those who would use it for domination, for greed, for bending the will of others. A cabal of corrupt masters had nearly succeeded in using the Great Bell itself to enslave the entire clan, their twisted melodies threatening to unravel the very harmony of Khazad-dûm. The true masters, the ones who remained faithful, realized that locking the bells away wasn't enough. The knowledge itself was the temptation. So, in their final act, they did not just hide the bells. They set a watch. They poured their own remorse, their grief over the betrayal, and their unwavering dedication to protection into a new creation. They didn't forge the Guardians from metal and fire. They composed them from the very essence of the mountain's most stable, fundamental resonant frequency. They are not monsters, Kaelen. They are a requiem, a song of mourning and protection, given physical form. Their entire purpose is to respond to any vibration that mimics the patterns of avarice, of coercion, of prideful force. Your hammer, its note was flawed, yes, but the intent behind it was pure. It was a note of seeking, of hope. That is the only reason we survived its first awakening. But when you used it to strike a counter frequency in the tunnel, you used force against force. You spoke to it in the only language it knows from its enemies, the language of conflict. And it answered in kind. The revelation shifted everything for Kaelen. The terrifying entity was not a mindless beast to be beaten or avoided, but a sophisticated lock that could only be opened with the right key. A key that was not made of metal, but of music and intent. Then how do we pass them? He asked, the weight of the challenge settling on him anew, but now accompanied by a thread of understanding. Lyra's expression became hesitant, a flicker of the old shame returning. There are fragments, whispers in the oldest texts, the creators in their mercy left a back door. A melody of appeasement. It wasn't a command, but a recognition, a way to say we are of the same purpose. She closed her eyes, concentrating, and from her lips came a soft, hesitant series of notes. It was a simple, descending scale, but there was something profoundly different about it. The notes did not just exist in the air, they seemed to interact with the silence around them, softening its edges, making the very air feel calmer. But as she reached the fifth note, her voice wavered, cracking slightly. She stopped, opening her eyes with a frustrated sigh. That's all I have, and I can't hold it. I never could. She looked at him, her vulnerability stark. Mastering it requires two things we are in desperately short supply of. The first is perfect pitch. Not just the ability to sing a note correctly, but to feel its absolute truth in your bones, to hold it steady against any counter vibration or distraction. The mountain itself will try to pull you out of tune. The second, she paused, searching for the words, is emotional clarity. The song is a reflection of intent. You cannot fake it. If you feel fear, the note will carry a tremolo of anxiety. If you feel anger, it will sharpen into a weapon. The guardian will hear the lie instantly. The melody requires a state of pure, selfless guardianship. You must hold in your heart not a desire to get past the protector, but a profound respect for its duty, and a shared desire to see that duty fulfilled through restoration, not destruction. It was a test not of skill, but of spirit, and in the echoing dark, with a broken tool and a fragment of a song, it felt like the most impossible challenge yet. The path beyond the guardian led them downward, through a series of winding, natural fissures that felt less like carved halls, and more like the ancient arteries of the mountain itself. The air grew still and cool, carrying a scent of old, undisturbed stone, and a silence so profound it felt like a physical presence. Then, the fissure opened without warning into a cavern of such immense scale that it seemed to defy the very geology around it. This was no natural formation. The hall of the ancestors was a perfect hemisphere, so vast its ceiling was lost in shadow, its curved walls sweeping away into the darkness on either side. And standing in a great circle at its center, illuminated by a single, pale beam of light, falling from some unseen aperture high above, were the statues. They were not memorials of kings or warriors. These were the master crafters, the legendary Bellmakers of Khazad-dûm's golden age, rendered in obsidian, granite, and veined marble, with a lifelike detail that was almost unnerving. Each figure was captured in a moment of focused work. One held a hammer poised over a crystalline anvil. Another cupped her ear, as if listening to a fading note. A third had his hands spread wide, seemingly conducting an invisible orchestra. Their faces were etched with the deep concentration of artists, communing with the fundamental forces of creation. The silence here was not empty. It was a held breath, awaiting. Lyra moved among them, her scholar's eyes wide with recognition, whispering names that were only legends in the world above. Boren the tuner, Freya of the clear chime, Durin's own master smith, Thorinstone's song. Kalin, however, felt their presence in a different way. The faint, damaged hum of his cracked hammer, which had been a constant, irregular buzz against his palm, suddenly changed. As he approached the circle of statues, the hammer's dissonance began to interact with the stillness of the hall. It wasn't a sound he heard with his ears, but a vibration he felt in his teeth, in the marrow of his bones. Each statue emitted a unique, incredibly subtle resonant frequency, a permanent harmonic signature locked into the stone by the unimaginable skill of their creators. He moved slowly around the circle, watching as the fractured light within his hammer's head would flicker and pulse as it passed each master, like a compass needle quivering toward true north. They're not just statues, he breathed, the realization dawning on him with the force of a physical blow. They're the lock. The harmonic map from the archives had spoken of a key, but he had imagined a physical object, a singular artifact. He saw now that he was wrong. The key was a sequence, a specific harmonic code that could only be generated by interacting with these silent sentinels in the correct order. Each of these masters had contributed a fundamental note to the great work of the bells, a unique sonic identity that was their life signature. To prove oneself worthy of approaching the great bell, one had to demonstrate an understanding of their collective harmony. The path forward would not open with a spoken password or a pulled lever, but with a song built from the individual essence of each of these giants, played back to the mountain in the precise order of its original creation. The Hall of the Ancestors was the ultimate test of a bellmaker's skill and spirit. His eyes were drawn to the base of each statue. There, almost hidden in the intricate carvings of tools and musical staves that adorned the plinths, was a small, perfectly polished crystal bell, no larger than his thumb. They were not decorative, they were the interfaces. To sound the note of Boren the tuner, one would have to strike his crystal bell with a perfect, unwavering strike that matched his legendary precision. To evoke Freya of the clear chime, one would have to produce a tone of such purity and sustain that it would hang in the air like a drop of morning dew. The task was monumental. It required not just the technical skill to produce each perfect note, but the deep, intuitive knowledge of which master came first in the sequence, whose harmonic principle was the foundation upon which the others were built. One mistake, one note out of place, or one tone imperfectly struck, and the lock would likely remain closed forever, or worse, trigger a final, devastating safeguard. The silence of the hall was no longer a held breath. It was a challenge issued across the centuries. The challenge before them was as delicate as it was daunting. The sequence was not written on any plinth or whispered by the stones. It was a puzzle written in the language of harmony itself, a code they would have to decipher through intuition and deep listening. Lyra immediately fell into her element, her earlier fear replaced by the calm focus of a scholar facing a complex text. She moved slowly around the circle of master crafters, her hand hovering just above each small crystal bell without touching it. "We cannot just play them," she murmured, her voice hushed in the immense space. "Each bell is tuned to the life's work of the master it represents. The sequence must reflect the order in which their harmonic principles build upon one another. Play them out of order, and the dissonance could be catastrophic." She closed her eyes, listening to the almost imperceptible hum each statue emitted, trying to hear the foundational note, the one upon which all others were built. Kaelin's approach was different, born from the forge rather than the library. He held his damaged tuning hammer before him like a dowsing rod, its cracked head buzzing erratically. He focused not on the sound, but on the vibration, the way the flawed tool reacted to the resonant signature of each ancestor. as he passed the statue of a dwarf, captured in the act of listening intently to a hammer strike. The tool in his hand gave a sudden, sharp pulse, its irregular hum smoothing out for just a fraction of a second into a clear, steady tone. "There," he said, his voice filled with certainty. "That's the first note, the listener. All harmony begins with listening." Lyra looked at him, surprised, then nodded slowly, a new respect in her eyes. His connection was intuitive, a craftsman's understanding that complemented her academic knowledge. Together, they began the painstaking work of mapping the sequence. Lyra would identify a possible candidate for the next note based on historical accounts of which masters collaborated, while Kalin would test her theory with his hammer, watching for the tool's resonant response. It was a slow, silent dance of deduction and feeling. After what felt like an age, they had a sequence of 7 masters. The moment of truth had arrived. Lyra, with her more precise control, would be the one to sound the bells. She took her position before the first statue, the listener, and raised a small, leather-wrapped mallet she carried for such delicate work. She took a steadying breath, finding a center of calm within herself, and struck the crystal bell. The note that rang out was pure and clear, hanging in the air with a sustain that seemed to go on forever. As it began to fade, she moved to the second statue, a crafter known for his work on sustaining resonance, and struck his bell. The 2 notes merged, not in a chord, but in a cascade, the second note catching the energy of the first and amplifying it, sending a visible shimmer through the air between the 2 statues. A low thrum of power began to build in the chamber. Hope surged within them. They were doing it. They were speaking the language of the ancestors. The third and fourth notes followed, each one layering upon the last, building a complex and beautiful harmonic structure that made the very light in the cavern seem brighter. The air thrummed with potential energy as Lyra approached the 5th statue, a master depicted with hands outstretched, her face a mask of intense concentration, known in the lore as the weaver of overtones. The pressure in the room was palpable. This was the most complex part of the sequence, where the foundational notes were woven together with higher, more delicate frequencies. Lyra's hand was steady, but a fine sheen of sweat glistened on her brow. The concentration required was immense. She struck the bell. The note was true, but in her focus on its purity, her mallet struck a fraction too hard. The crystal, perfectly tuned and unimaginably old, was stressed beyond its tolerance. Instead of a clean ring, the note was followed by a sharp, sickening crack. A hairline fracture appeared on the surface of the bell. For a horrifying second, nothing happened. Then, from the base of the statue itself, a fine, glittering powder began to seep out, not like dust, but like a liquid cloud of ground crystal and stone. It billowed into the air, expanding rapidly with a faint hissing sound, catching the beam of light from above and turning it into a blinding, disorienting haze. The cloud did not simply obscure vision, it attacked the senses directly. Inhaling the faintest amount made the head spin and the stomach lurch. Sounds became distorted and muffled, as if they were hearing the world from underwater. Their own sense of balance was thrown into chaos, the solid floor beneath their feet seeming to tilt and sway. The beautiful, building harmony of the sequence shattered into a jarring dissonance that grated against their nerves. Lyra stumbled back, coughing, her eyes watering, the mallet falling from her suddenly clumsy fingers. The clear focus they had built together evaporated in an instant, replaced by confusion and a rising tide of panic. They were blind, deafened, and unbalanced in a chamber of immense power, with the sequence half complete and a safeguard now triggered. Their coordination, their trust, their very senses were being put to the ultimate test, and the mountain waited, silent and judging, to see if they would break. The disorienting cloud from the cracked statue began to settle, its shimmering particles drifting to the floor like a blanket of silent, glittering snow. Kaelen and Lyra were still coughing, their heads swimming, their equilibrium slowly returning as the sensory assault faded. The beautiful, building harmony they had painstakingly created was gone, replaced by the grim, disapproving silence of the half-activated hall. And then, that silence was broken by a new, all too familiar sound, the heavy, rhythmic tread of armored boots, echoing with purpose from the passageway they had entered. A moment later, the beam of light from above was cut by solid, broad silhouettes. Elder Boren stood at the forefront of a dozen clansmen, their faces set in hard lines beneath their helms, their hands resting on the hafts of their work axes, tools that could be weapons in a pinch. They had arrived not as rescuers, but as enforcers. Boren's eyes swept the scene, taking in the cracked crystal bell, the settling dust, the looks of dazed failure on the two intruders' faces. His own expression was a storm of relief that they were alive and furious confirmation of his every fear. This folly ends now. His voice boomed in the vast chamber, devoid of its earlier weary pleading, ringing with the absolute authority of the Elder Council. You see what your recklessness brings, desecration. You tamper with forces you cannot control, damaging the legacy you claim to honor. He gestured sharply to the men behind him. Secure them. We return to the halls. This chamber will be resealed, and this path forgotten for good. The clansmen advanced, their movements cautious but determined. The standoff was immediate and tense, a line drawn not just across the stone floor, but between two irreconcilable views of the world. Kalin, his heart hammering against his ribs, stepped forward, placing himself between the advancing dwarves and Lyra, who was still trying to clear the last of the dust from her eyes. He held up his hands, not in surrender, but in a desperate plea for them to stop, to listen. "You're right, Elder," Kaelen said, his voice strained but clear, cutting through the tension. "We made a mistake. A crack appeared, but you're wrong to think the answer is to turn away and let the silence grow heavier." He gestured around at the towering, silent statues of the masters. They didn't build these wonders to be forgotten behind sealed doors. They built them to sing, and that song is fading. With every year that passes, the echoes grow fainter. The harmonies decay. The memory of how to even listen to them is dying with us, right now. He looked from Boren's stony face to the uncertain expressions of the clansmen behind him. These were not strangers. They were smiths and miners, fathers and brothers he had worked alongside his entire life. He spoke to them now, his voice rising with a passion that was raw and unpolished, but utterly sincere. "You feel it, don't you, the quiet weight in the forges, the sense that something is missing from the beat of our hammers, the heat of our fires. Our work is strong, but it has no song anymore. It has no heart. That is the silence the ancestors feared, not the noise of our trying." He turned his gaze back to Boren, his eyes pleading for understanding. "This isn't just about a bell, it's about us. If we leave now, If we seal this hall and never return, we are not protecting our legacy. We are burying it. We are admitting that our greatest achievements are too dangerous for us to even remember. This isn't caution, Elder. This is a funeral for our own spirit. He took a shuddering breath, the weight of his next words hanging in the air. The sentinels are awake. The path is known. If we do not try now, with the little knowledge and hope we still have, then it will never be tried again. The echo will fade for the last time, and the mountain will hold its breath forever. This is not recklessness. This is our last chance. The chamber was utterly still. The clansmen had stopped their advance, looking to Boren for guidance, but their eyes were on Kalin, his words striking a chord they all felt but had never dared to name. Boren stood rigid, the conflict within him plain on his face. He saw the cracked statue, the undeniable evidence of failure and danger, but he also heard the undeniable truth in Kalen's voice, a truth that echoed the very same longing he had stifled in his own heart for decades. It was a standoff between the security of tradition and the terrifying, fragile gamble of hope. The fate of the quest, and perhaps the future of their people, hung in the balance of that silence. The tense silence in the hall of the ancestors was shattered not by a voice, but by the mountain itself. A deep, grinding tremor rolled through the chamber, a vibration so powerful it was less a sound and more a physical force that shook the stone beneath their feet and sent a shower of dust and small pebbles from the unseen ceiling high above. The towering statues of the master crafters seemed to sway for a terrifying second, their ancient forms groaning in protest. This was no natural settling of the earth. This was a directed, angry pulse of energy, a clear and present declaration that the awakened guardians were no longer merely stirring in the depths. They were actively hunting, and their influence could shake the very foundations of the stronghold. The immediate threat of the standoff was instantly rendered trivial by the far greater threat, shaking the walls around them. Instinct took over. The clansmen, trained for cave-ins and structural instability, immediately braced themselves against the nearest statues, their professional discipline overriding their orders. Elder Boren, his face pale with a fear that had nothing to do with Kalen's rebellion, threw out an arm to steady himself against Thorin Stone Song's plinth. Lyra, her scholar's mind analyzing the frequency of the tremor even as she fought for balance, called out, "It's a convergence pulse. They're searching for us, using the mountain's own resonant channels. They'll collapse every tunnel between here and the surface to trap us." In that moment of shared, primal danger, the line between the two groups dissolved. They were no longer enforcers and trespassers. They were dwarves trapped in a deepening crisis, and the mountain itself was turning against them. The tremor subsided as suddenly as it had begun, leaving behind a ringing silence that was somehow more frightening than the noise. The air was thick with dust and dread. Boren slowly straightened up, his eyes scanning the cavern with a new, grim calculation. The theoretical dangers he had warned of were now terrifyingly real. His gaze fell upon Kaelen and Lyra, not with anger, but with a stark, reluctant acknowledgement. Their warning had been proven right. Turning back was no longer a simple matter of choice. The path behind them was likely already compromised, choked with rock, and patrolled by beings of solidified sound. To remain here was to be entombed. Their only hope, as insane as it seemed, was to push forward, deeper into the very heart of the danger. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his entire leadership, Boren gestured to one of the older clansmen, a grizzled veteran with a scar running through his beard. The dwarf nodded, understanding the unspoken command, and pulled a leather-wrapped tube from his pack. It was not a standard-issue clan map. This was something older, its leather casing stained dark with age, and handled so often the edges were worn soft. Boren unrolled it carefully on the flat surface of an anvil-carved plinth. The map was not drawn on parchment, but on a thin, laminated sheet of treated fungus paper, and it depicted the lower depths of Khazad-dûm in a style of cartography that had been obsolete for centuries. The routes were not simple lines but swirling, harmonic patterns, with annotations in the same complex runic script Kalin had found in the archives. "This was my grandfather's," Boren said, his voice low and gruff, each word a reluctant admission. He was part of the last team that tried to assess. The deep halls after the great silence fell. Only he returned. He drew this from memory before his own mind fell silent. He pointed a thick finger to a section of the map, marked with delicate, warning runes that shimmered with a faint, embedded crystal dust. "The direct path you are following is a death trap. It leads through the Gorge of Discord, where the echoes of the ancient betrayal are still so strong they can shatter a dwarf's sanity. The Guardians will be converging there, expecting anyone foolish enough to come that way." His finger then traced a narrower, more circuitous route that branched off and wound its way through a vast area, labeled in stark, clear letters, the Crystal Caves. "This is the only other way." He called it the Path of Stillness. "It is not safe, but it might be safer than certain death." Lyra leaned in, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fascination. "The Crystal Caves, the texts speak of them only in warnings. They are not simply caves with crystals in them. The entire geological structure is a single, massive, complex harmonic resonator. The crystals grow in precise acoustic formations. A single sound, even a too loud footfall or the clink of armor, can be amplified 1,000-fold, focused by the natural formations into a sonic blade capable of shearing through solid rock or shattering every crystal in the vicinity, bringing the entire ceiling down in a rain of glassy shards. The route was not safer because it was unguarded. It was safer only if they could move with absolute, perfect silence. It was a path that demanded not courage, but utter and complete discipline. Boren looked from the map to the group, his expression making it clear that this was not a choice, but a desperate necessity forced upon them by the consequences of their own actions, and the only thread of hope they had left to grasp. The shift from the grand, if tense, hall of the ancestors to the path of stillness was like stepping from a cathedral into a frozen, glass-lined heart. The air changed instantly, becoming so still and dry it seemed to suck the sound from their very lungs before it could be born. The passage narrowed into a tight, winding fissure, its walls gradually transforming from rough-hewn stone to a seamless, glittering matrix of countless intergrown crystals. They were not decorations, they were the architecture. Amethyst, clear quartz, and deep blue celestine grew in massive, sharp-angled formations that speared from floor to ceiling, met in the middle, and twisted into chaotic, beautiful chandeliers of solid light. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly terrifying, for the beauty was a lethal trap. Light behaved strangely here. The single beam from Boren's lantern didn't simply illuminate, it fractured, splintering into 1,000 dancing rays that ricocheted through the crystalline forest, creating a disorienting kaleidoscope of shifting shadows and blinding highlights. There were no true shadows, only deeper complexities of light. This visual chaos was a perfect mirror for the acoustic nightmare they now faced. Lyra immediately signaled a halt just inside the entrance, her face grim in the fractured light. She held up a single finger, the universal sign for silence, but her expression made it clear this was not a simple request. It was a law of survival as absolute as gravity. She then pointed to her ear, and in the profound stillness, they all heard it. The cave was not silent. It was filled with a constant, incredibly high-pitched hum, the collective resonant frequency of the crystals themselves, a sound normally beyond the range of Dwarven hearing, but which here, in this massive, focused array, pressed against the edge of perception like a needle. It was the sound of unimaginable tension, of potential energy held in a perfect, fragile balance. This was the baseline. Any noise they made would not simply be added to this hum. It would interact with it, be absorbed by it, and amplified by the precise natural geometries of the cave into something catastrophic. A dropped tool, a scuff of a boot, even a sharp intake of breath, could act like a pebble dropped into a perfectly still pond. But the ripples here would be shards of glass and collapsing tonnage of rock. Their progress became a slow, agonizing ballet of absolute discipline. Every movement had to be planned 3 steps ahead. They communicated not with hands, but with eyes, with the slow, deliberate tilt of a head, with a held breath. Placing a foot was a minute-long process, first identifying a patch of bare, stable-looking stone, then shifting weight onto it with the agonizing slowness of a settling glacier, ensuring not a grain of sand was disturbed. The clansmen, used to the hearty, robust noises of the forge and the mine, were like great bears trying to tiptoe through a field of frozen leaves. Their heavy armor, once their pride, was now their greatest liability. Every creak of leather, every faint clink of a mail ring, sounded to their strained nerves like a thunderclap in the dreadful, humming silence. The strain was not just physical, it was a profound test of patience and trust. They were a chain of survival, and the weakest link would doom them all. They had to trust that the person behind them was being just as careful, just as controlled. There was no room for independent action, no space for a moment of forgetfulness. The mental fatigue was immense, a constant, grinding pressure that wore away at their focus. Minutes felt like hours. The cave seemed to have no end, its glittering, deceptive beauty becoming a monotonous hell of hypervigilance. The only measure of progress was the slow, aching burn in their thighs from the controlled, minimal movements, and the dry ache in their throats from suppressed coughs and held breath. It was in this state of extreme tension that Kalin noticed it. He was following Lyra, his eyes fixed on her feet, mirroring her every step with painstaking care. As they navigated a particularly narrow aisle between 2 towering amethyst columns, he saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her left hand where it brushed against her thigh. At first, he thought it was a trick of the fractured light, but as they paused to let Boren survey the path ahead, he saw it again, a consistent, fine shiver that ran through her fingers. It was the tremor of someone holding an immense force in check, the physical manifestation of a fear she was masterfully suppressing. She held her body with the rigid control of a scholar, but her hands, the tools of her art, betrayed a deep, old anxiety. Later, when they were forced to press themselves against a cold crystal wall to allow a clansman to carefully test the stability of a floor section ahead, Kalin dared to lean closer to her, his movement slower than a growing stalactite. He didn't speak. He couldn't. Instead, he gently tapped his own fingers against his leg, then nodded almost imperceptibly towards her hand. He raised his eyebrows in a silent question. Lyra's eyes, wide and strained, met his. For a long moment, she held his gaze, and he saw the conflict there, the pride warring with the confession. Then, her shoulders slumped in a silent sigh of defeat. She glanced ahead to ensure the others were distracted by the pathfinding. Then she held up her trembling hand between them, a silent admission of her deepest shame. Her eyes told the story her voice could not. They flickered with the memory of a different cave, a different experiment. A younger, more confident Lyra, convinced her calculations were perfect, striking a tuning fork against a crystal formation to measure its resonant frequency. But her pitch had been a fraction off, her strike a touch too fervent. The crystal had not simply resonated, it had screamed, a high-frequency shriek that traveled through the network of geodes at lightning speed. The result was not a full collapse, but a localized shatter, a rain of dagger-sharp splinters and a crack that spiderwebbed across the ceiling above her. She had escaped unharmed, physically, but the sound of that shattering, the proof of her own miscalculation, had never left her. It was the ghost that haunted her hands, the reason she now feared her own expertise. In this place, where her knowledge was their only guide, her greatest fear was that her own body would betray her again and become the instrument of their doom. Kaelen didn't offer a solution with words. There were none. He simply looked from her trembling hand back to her eyes, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod of understanding. There was no judgment in his gaze, only a shared acknowledgement of the burden she carried. He then did the only thing he could think of. He slowly, carefully, brought his own hand up and placed it flat against the cold, humming crystal wall beside them. He closed his eyes, not to block out the world, but to feel it. He focused on the steady, high-frequency hum of the cave, not as a threat, but as a fact. A constant. He took a long, silent breath, and then another, willing his own body to still, to find a rhythm within the tension. He wasn't asking her to stop the tremor. He was offering a point of focus, a shared calm in the eye of the storm. Lyra watched him, her own breathing slowing to match his rhythm. After a moment, she mirrored him, pressing her own palm flat against the living crystal. The tremor in her hand didn't vanish, but its frantic edge softened, smoothed by the relentless, neutral hum of the mountain. The trust between them, already forged in fire, was now tempered in the unbearable silence, becoming something stronger and more resilient than the crystal that surrounded them. The tension inside the crystal caves was a living thing, a pressure that weighed not on the ears but on the soul, demanding a perfection of stillness that felt almost unnatural. Every breath was a conscious act of control, every muscle held in a state of rigid poise to prevent the slightest betraying sound. Kalen's world had narrowed to the placement of his own feet and the careful movements of Lyra just ahead of him, her form a silhouette against the mesmerizing, fractured light of the colossal crystals. She was their guide, their acoustic cartographer in this lethally beautiful maze, and he trusted her knowledge implicitly, mirroring her every step with the focus of a dancer in a deadly ballet. It was during one of these painstaking pauses, as they waited for Elder Boren to survey a narrow path ahead, that Kalin saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor in Lyra's left hand, where it rested against her leg. At first, he dismissed it as a trick of the shimmering air, a distortion caused by the countless crystal facets, refracting the dim lantern light. But as they moved again, inching through a particularly narrow corridor between two massive amethyst columns that seemed to pulse with their own internal energy, he saw the tremor once more. This time, it was unmistakable, a fine, constant shiver running through her fingers, a stark contrast to the absolute stillness her body otherwise maintained. It was the tremor of a tightly coiled spring, of a fear so masterfully contained that it could only find release through this one tiny physical betrayal. In this place, where a single misplaced sound could unleash a cataclysm of shattering rock, that tremor was not a minor detail. It was a potential fault line running through their only hope of survival. The opportunity to address it came when the group was forced to press themselves against a cold, humming wall of quartz to allow a clansman to test the stability of a floor section ahead. The space was so tight that Kaelen stood shoulder to shoulder with Lyra, the silence between them thicker than the mountain rock. Slowly, with movements more gradual than the growth of the crystals around them, he turned his head toward her. He didn't speak. Words were forbidden currency here. Instead, he gently tapped his own steady fingers against his thigh, then let his gaze drift meaningfully to her trembling hand before returning his eyes to hers, his expression filled not with accusation, but with quiet concern. Lyra's reaction was immediate and visceral. Her eyes, wide and strained from hours of hypervigilance, flickered with a deep, old shame. For a long moment, she held his gaze, a silent war playing out on her face, the proud scholar warring with the humiliated apprentice. Then, her shoulders slumped in a soundless sigh of surrender. She glanced ahead to ensure the others were fully occupied, then slowly, hesitantly, held her trembling hand up between them in the fractured light. It was a confession without words, an admission of a ghost that had followed her into this deepest and most dangerous of places. Her eyes told the story, her voice could not. They glazed with the memory of a different cavern, years ago. A younger, brilliantly confident Lyra, her head filled with equations and harmonic theory, certain she had calculated the precise frequency needed to stimulate a dormant echo crystal for study. She remembered the feel of the tuning fork in her hand, the clean strike, and the note that sang out, a note that was not pure, but flawed by a hubris she hadn't known she possessed. The crystal hadn't resonated, it had screamed. The sound, a fraction off the perfect pitch, had traveled through the interconnected geodes like lightning, triggering not a full collapse, but a localized explosion of shattering rock and a rain of glass-sharp splinters. She had escaped physically unscathed, but the sound of that catastrophic miscalculation had never left her. It was the ghost that haunted her hands. The reason her greatest fear was not the guardians or the chasms, but the terrifying potential of her own expertise to once again become the instrument of ruin. Kaelen listened to this silent story and felt a profound shift in his understanding. This was not simple nervousness. It was the weight of past trauma, a shadow that threatened to eclipse her immense value in the very moment they needed it most. He didn't offer empty reassurance with a shake of his head or a forced smile. There were no words that could erase that memory. Instead, he offered solidarity. Slowly, carefully, he brought his own hand up and pressed his palm flat against the cold, resonating surface of the quartz wall beside them. He closed his eyes, not to shut out the world, but to feel it, to find the steady, high-frequency hum that underpinned the terrifying silence, and accept it as a simple fact of this place, neither friend nor foe, but a constant to be respected. He took a long, silent breath, focusing on the vibration traveling from the mountain into his bones, willing his own body to find a rhythm within the immense tension. Lyra watched him, her own breath beginning to slow and deepen, unconsciously syncing with his. After a moment of hesitation, she mirrored him, pressing her own trembling palm against the living crystal. The second her skin made contact with the cool, vibrating stone, something changed. The frantic, isolated tremor in her hand was suddenly absorbed into a far greater, more powerful vibration, the relentless, neutral hum of the mountain itself. It didn't stop the shaking entirely, but it contextualized it, smoothing its jagged edge into a mere part of the cave's immense energy. The individual fear was subsumed into the collective reality of their environment. It was a silent lesson in harmony, not the elimination of discord, but its integration into a larger, stable whole. When the clansmen signaled the all clear, Lyra pulled her hand from the wall. The tremor was still there, but it was fainter, a mere echo of its former self. She met Kaelin's eyes and gave a single, sharp nod, her gaze clear and focused once more. The ghost had been acknowledged, and in that acknowledgement, it had lost some of its power. She turned back to the path ahead, her movements regaining their former precision. Her knowledge was once again their guide, but now it was tempered by a hard-won humility and a shared calm. She led them through the final, most delicate section of the caves, a vast cavern where the crystals grew in a complex arching pattern that acted as a natural amplifier, her instructions given through the most subtle of gestures executed with a renewed steadiness. They emerged from the glittering, lethal beauty of the caves into a wider tunnel, the heavy silence lifting like a physical weight from their shoulders, having passed through the gauntlet, not just through skill, but through a shared moment of understanding that had steadied the one hand they could not afford to fail. The tunnel beyond the crystal caves opened into a space that felt less like a room and more like a tomb for a fundamental force. This was the Forge of Resonance, the legendary cradle where the great bell of Boren had been sung into existence. The air, which should have thrummed with the memory of that mighty act of creation, was instead still and heavy, a suffocating blanket of absolute silence. The forge itself was a monumental circular chamber, its walls scarred by the ancient fires of its purpose, its center dominated by a massive, concave casting pit that looked like a dry stone wound. But the architecture of genius was now obscured, strangled by an invasive, alien growth. Sonic fungi cloaked every surface in a grotesque, living carpet. It grew in pulsing, phosphorescent clusters of mauve and sickly gray, their surfaces not smooth but covered in tiny, hair-like cilia that quivered in the still air. The most unsettling part was the absolute void of noise, the cautious scuff of a boot, the clink of a tool, even Boren's low grunt of dismay. All were swallowed the moment they were born, absorbed without echo or trace by the trembling organisms. It was a silence that felt aggressive, a sensory deprivation that was actively hostile. Lyra knelt, careful not to touch the nearest growth, her eyes wide with a mixture of revulsion and fascination. "It's a damping field," she whispered, and the words died inches from her lips, the very sound waves consumed before they could reach Kaelin's ears. She had to gesture him closer, her mouth nearly touching his ear to be heard. "They don't just grow here, they feed on acoustic energy. They've starved this place of its very soul. We cannot proceed until we clear a path. The harmonics needed to open the way forward cannot exist in this void." The solution was as dangerous as the problem. They couldn't simply burn or cut the fungi. Any violent physical action could cause the mature clusters to release a cloud of spores that would permanently deafen anyone caught in the cloud, and might spread the infestation deeper into the mountain. The answer had to be acoustic. They had to use sound itself to cleanse the forge of the things that consumed it. They had to fight fire with fire, but with a precision that bordered on the impossible. Lyra theorized that a specific, carefully modulated frequency, one that mimicked the natural resonant frequency of the fungi's cellular structure, could cause them to vibrate themselves apart, to essentially shatter from the inside out without releasing their spores. It was a cleansing frequency, a note of pure, focused vibrational force. All eyes turned to Kaelen and the damaged tool in his hands. His cracked tuning hammer, which had hummed with such potential in the old workshop, now felt like a dead, broken thing. Its song was flawed, its resonance unstable. To ask it to produce a note of such precise, destructive purity was like asking a cracked bell to ring true. The weight of the task settled on him, a physical pressure. He looked from the expectant, anxious faces of the clansmen to the silent, oppressive blanket of fungi, and felt a surge of despair. This was the moment his journey either culminated or ended. He closed his eyes, his grip tightening on the haft of the hammer, not in strength, but in a desperate plea. He thought of the faint hum that had started it all, of the runes in the archive, of the trust in Lyra's eyes, and the reluctant hope in Boren's. This tool was not just metal and wood. It was a vessel for his will, for the belief of an entire people. He had to pour all of that into the strike. He approached the edge of the fungal growth, the others holding back. He raised the hammer, its star metal head gleaming dully in the faint light. He took a deep breath, not of air, but of resolve, focusing his entire being on a single, pure intent, not destruction, but purification. He sought the note in his mind, the one Lyra had described, and he channeled every ounce of his hope, his fear, and his unwavering belief into the shape of that sound. With a final, silent prayer to the ancestors whose forge this was, he struck the hammer against a bare patch of the stone floor. The sound that erupted was not the clean, clear tone he had hoped for. It was a ragged, straining note, a scream of metal and willpower. The crack in the hammer head glowed with a fierce, white-hot light, threatening to split entirely. For a terrifying second, nothing happened. Then, the nearest cluster of fungi began to vibrate, its sickly glow intensifying to a painful brightness. The vibrations spread through the networked growths like a wave, a visible ripple of distorting force, moving through the chamber. The fungi didn't just wither, they crystallized, their pulpy forms turning brittle and opaque, before shattering into a fine, harmless dust that settled like gray snow. Kalin held the note, pouring his energy through the damaged tool, his body trembling with the strain. He could feel the hammer disintegrating in his grasp, the crack widening, the song within it dying. He was not just clearing a path, he was sacrificing the key to do it. just as his strength began to fail, as the ragged note started to falter, and the hammer felt moments from exploding in his hand, Lyra stepped forward. She placed her hands over his on the haft, her touch steady and sure. She did not try to take over, she joined him. She began to hum, not the same note, but a perfect harmonic complement to it, a supporting frequency that stabilized his straining tone and gave it a foundation it lacked. Her voice, clear and confident, wove around his failing strike, reinforcing it, guiding it. Together, their combined will, his raw power and her precise knowledge flowed through the hammer. The note smoothed out, becoming the pure, cleansing frequency she had theorized. The effect became instantaneous and total. The fungal growth shattered in a wave that swept through the entire forge, dissolving into dust until the last, faint cluster by the far wall crystallized and vanished. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer a void, it was an empty vessel. The oppressive weight was gone, replaced by the natural, waiting quiet of an empty hall. The ancient stone of the forge stood bare and clean, revealed for the first time in centuries. Kalin opened his eyes, his arms leaden with exhaustion. The hammer in his hands was now cool and silent, the crack running through its head a permanent scar, its internal song utterly extinguished. He had given all of his energy to that one desperate effort. But as he looked at the cleared path, at the revealed casting pit, and at Lyra, whose face shone with a triumphant confidence she had not possessed before, he knew the sacrifice had not been in vain. They had purified the forge, and in doing so, they had proven that their harmony was stronger than any silence. The air in the forge remained unnervingly still, the oppressive silence broken only by the ragged sound of Kaelin's own breathing. He stood swaying slightly, his hands still curled around the haft of the hammer, now cold and utterly silent in his grasp. The great, star metal head was a web of fine fractures, the mithril inlay dull and dead. It was no longer a tool, it was a relic, its purpose spent in that one monumental effort. The exhaustion that washed over him was more than physical. It was a deep, spiritual drain, as if he had poured the very song of his own spirit through the metal to achieve that cleansing note. His vision swam, the edges darkening, and his knees began to buckle under the immense weight of his depletion. But before he could collapse onto the stone floor, now dusted with the gray remains of the sonic fungi, Lyra was there. Her arms slid firmly around his waist, taking his weight, her grip surprisingly strong. She did not speak. Words felt too crude for the space that now hummed with a potential it hadn't known for centuries. Instead, she guided him gently to sit against the clean, cool wall of the forge, her actions efficient and certain. The look she gave him was not one of pity, but of profound respect. He had done the impossible with a broken instrument, channeling a purity of intent that had overcome the tool's physical flaws, and in doing so, he had handed the final, delicate work to her. The chamber was clear, but the path was not yet open. The cleansing frequency had been a blunt instrument, a massive sonic scrub that eradicated the infestation. But to awaken the forge's original purpose, to convince the ancient stone to reveal its secrets, required a far more nuanced touch. It needed a sequence, a specific harmonic code that would signal to the mountain that the true heirs had returned, not as conquerors, but as healers. Lyra turned from Kaelen to face the vast, empty casting pit. This was her moment. The theory she had been exiled for, the knowledge she had cultivated in lonely exile, was no longer an abstract concept. It was the key in her hands. She closed her eyes, blocking out the worried murmurs of the clansmen and Boren's watchful gaze. In her mind, she wasn't in a dead forge. She was standing in the midst of its glory. She could hear the phantom ring of 1,000 hammers, the roar of harmonic fires, the focused silence of masters at work. The sequence was not written down. It was woven into the lore, a melody of activation passed down through generations of keepers. She began to hum, not a single note, but a complex, interwoven pattern of sound. Her voice, initially soft and hesitant, grew in strength and clarity as she moved around the perimeter of the chamber. She was not just singing, she was tracing the invisible ley lines of power within the rock, her footsteps a deliberate part of the rhythm. Where Kalen's effort had been a surge of raw power, Lyra's was an act of precise calibration. She would pause, press her palm against a specific point on the wall, and sing a short, crystalline phrase into the stone. The rock would answer with a soft, deep thrum, a note of recognition that vibrated up through their boots. With each successful interaction, her confidence bloomed visibly. The nervous tremor that had plagued her in the crystal caves was gone, replaced by the steady assurance of a master in her element. She was not the disgraced scholar here. She was Lyra, the lore keeper, and she was speaking the mountain's native tongue. The final note of her sequence was the highest and purest, a note that seemed to hang in the air, shimmering for an impossible length of time. As it finally began to fade, a new sound emerged, a deep, grinding rumble that came not from the walls, but from the very center of the forge. The massive stone slab at the bottom of the dry casting pit, which had seemed seamless and eternal, began to move. With the sound of ancient mechanics stirring to life after an eon of sleep, the slab split down the middle, and the two halves slid smoothly apart, retracting into the walls. Where there had been solid stone, there was now only a yawning darkness, from which a rush of cold, stale air flowed upward, carrying the scent of deep, undisturbed time and the faint, metallic tang of something immense and waiting. A hidden passage, a throat leading directly into the root of the mountain, had been revealed. The way to the great bell was open. The hidden passage revealed not a simple staircase, but a sheer, spiraling shaft that plunged into a darkness so absolute it seemed to drink the light from their lanterns. A current of ancient, frigid air flowed upward from the depths, carrying with it the scent of ozone and cold, forgotten metal. This was the final descent, the root of the mountain, and the air itself felt charged with a latent power that raised the hair on their arms. They secured their ropes to the only anchor point, a massive iron ring set into the forge's floor, so old its surface was pitted smooth by time, and began the slow, careful rappel into the void. The climb down was a journey out of time, the sounds of the world above fading, until there was only the whisper of rope on rock and the frantic beating of their own hearts. The darkness was a physical presence, a weight that pressed in on them, making each footfall on the seemingly endless wall feel like a step into oblivion. Then, without warning, the wall fell away. Kalen's boot met not rough stone, but a floor of polished obsidian, so black it seemed to be a hole in the universe. He unclipped his rope, his lantern held high, and the light did not simply illuminate the space. It was swallowed by the immensity, revealing the chamber in agonizingly slow increments. This was not a hall built by hands. It was a geode on a planetary scale. The walls, the ceiling soaring into invisibility high above, were a single, continuous crystal formation, a lattice of amethyst and deep blue beryl that glowed with a faint, internal luminescence. The air hummed with a subsonic frequency they felt in their bones, a deep, patient heartbeat that was the core rhythm of the mountain itself. And at the very center of this celestial cavity, bathed in the crystal's ethereal light, stood the reason for their impossible journey. The great bell of Durin. It was both smaller and far more immense than Kalin had ever imagined. It was not a crude lump of metal, but a work of art so perfect it seemed less forged and more grown from the heart of a star. Its form was a graceful, flowing curve, its surface etched with spiraling patterns that were not mere decoration, but a visual representation of harmonic equations, a map of sound itself. It should have been the source of the chamber's light and song, the sun around which this crystal universe revolved, but it was broken. A single, jagged crack ran from its lip down its side, a black scar against the muted silver gold of the mysterious alloy. And it was silent, not just quiet, but utterly, voidly mute, as if the very concept of sound had been surgically removed from its form. Worse than the crack was what held it. A web of solidified echoes encased the bell like a shroud. It was not a physical substance, but a visible distortion in the air, a complex net of shimmering, frozen light that seemed to pulse with a sickly, captured energy. Tendrils of this solidified sound wrapped around the bell's stand and anchored it to the crystal floor, binding it in a prison of its own lost music. This was no mere damage from age or accident. This was a wound, a magical necrosis that had frozen the bell at the moment of its greatest trauma. As Kaelen approached, the hum of the crystal chamber seemed to dim, as if in mourning. He reached a hand out, not to touch, but to feel the space around the bell. A profound cold radiated from it, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature and everything to do with absence. It was the chill of a song that had been strangled in its throat. Lyra moved to his side, her scholar's eyes wide with a horror that surpassed fear. "It is not broken," she breathed, her voice a tiny, stolen thing in the vast silence. "It is unmade. The crack is not in the metal. It is in its song. The harmony that gave it form and purpose has been severed." She explained that a bell of this nature was not an object that produced sound. It was a vessel for a pre-existing fundamental resonance. The metal, the shape, the inscriptions, they were all just a focus, a lens for a power that was as much spiritual as it was physical. The web was not a cage built by others. It was a scab formed from the bell's own leaking essence, a self-made tomb of congealed energy. Kaelen understood then, with a certainty that settled deep into his soul. This was not a task for a smith's hammer, not even one forged from star metal. You could not weld this crack shut. You could not simply pour new metal into the mold. The fracture was metaphysical. To repair it required not a mending of form, but a reigniting of spirit. It required a spark of life, a transfusion of raw, willing energy to bridge the gap in the bell's shattered song. It would demand a sacrifice. A bell maker did not just shape metal. They poured a piece of their own intention, their own focus, their very life force into their work to awaken the resonance within. For a bell this mighty, born of Durin's own age, the sacrifice required would be correspondingly vast. It would not be a matter of skill alone, but of essence. To heal the heart of the mountain, he would have to offer a piece of his own, The decision settled in Kalen's heart, not as a choice, but as a certainty. The sacrifice required was clear: to reignite the bell's extinguished song, a new spark of life had to be offered willingly into the void of its silence. It would cost him not just his energy, but a piece of his own essence, a permanent diminishing of the very spirit that had driven him here. He met Lyra's eyes, and in her grim, understanding nod, he found the strength to accept the price. There was no time for hesitation. He stepped toward the silent, shrouded bell, his hands outstretched, his entire being focused on the act of giving. He would pour his hope, his memory, his love for the song of his people directly into the cold metal, a transfusion of spirit to bridge the metaphysical crack. But the mountain's immune system would not allow such a profound change to go unchallenged. As Kalin began to gather his focus, to draw his energy inward for the offering, a deep, dissonant chord shuddered through the crystal chamber. From the single entrance high above, the shaft they had rappelled down, a wave of distorted light and angry sound began to pour. The guardians had found them. Not one or two, but a convergence of the stone sentinel spirits, drawn by the immense concentration of intent and the lingering echoes of the cleansed forge. They flowed into the cavern like a waterfall of solidified wrath, their forms shifting from the shape of armored dwarves to amorphous beings of vibrating rock and captured echoes, their collective hum a weapon aimed at the heart of the intrusion. For a moment, sheer terror froze everyone in place. The clansmen recoiled, raising their axes and hammers against an enemy that could not be cut or broken. Elder Boren, however, did not flinch. The theoretical danger he had feared his entire life was now a physical tsunami of vengeance descending upon them, and in that moment, his own resolve crystallized. He saw Kaelen, vulnerable and focused before the bell, on the cusp of an act that could either save or doom them all. He saw the desperate, hopeless stance of his men. His fear did not vanish. It was forged into something harder. He slammed the haft of his axe against the obsidian floor, the sharp crack, a defiant answer to the dissonant hum. To me, his voice boomed, no longer that of a cautious elder, but of a battlefield commander. Shield wall, hold the entrance, give him the time he needs. It was a suicidal command. The entrance was not a narrow doorway, but the entire opening of the shaft, a gaping maw 20 feet across. There were a dozen of them, against a seemingly endless flow of elemental protectors. But Boren's transformed authority ignited a fire in the clansmen. They were no longer just following orders, they were buying a future. They rushed forward, not with the disciplined march of trained soldiers, but with the desperate, roaring courage of dwarves defending their heart. They interlocked their shields, not to form a perfect barrier, an impossibility, but to create a breakwater against the tide. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their bodies a living, breathing wall between the converging guardians and Kalen's desperate work. The clash was not of metal on metal, but of will against ancient magic. The first wave of guardians hit the dwarf line not as a physical impact, but as a concussive blast of sonic force. Shields splintered, mail rings shattered, men were thrown backward, their cries lost in the overwhelming roar, but those behind them surged forward to plug the gaps, swinging their hammers and axes not at solid forms, but at the vibrations themselves, disrupting the coalescing shapes with pure, brute force. Boren was everywhere, his own axe a blur, not dealing damage but parrying waves of force, shouting encouragement, dragging wounded men back from the fray. It was a battle of attrition they were destined to lose. Each passing second was purchased with bruises, broken bones, and the exhausting drain of standing against a power that felt as infinite as the mountain itself. The sounds of the struggle, the shouts of the clansmen, the shriek of tearing metal, the earth-shaking pulses of the guardians echoed through the vast chamber, a cacophony of violence that was a direct assault on Kalen's concentration. Each cry of pain was a hook trying to pull his focus away from the bell. Each tremor through the floor threatened to break his connection. The pressure was immense, a physical weight on his soul. He could not help his friends. He could not fight. His only weapon was his stillness. His only contribution to the battle was to complete his task before the brave, failing wall behind him was completely overrun. He closed his eyes, not to block out the chaos, but to look inward, to find the core of his own song amidst the surrounding discord. The sacrifice had to be made now, and it had to be perfect. The courage of Boren and the others demanded nothing less. Their risk was the crucible in which his own resolve was being tempered, forcing his hands to steady and his heart to open, pouring his energy toward the silent bell with a speed and purity born of utter desperation. The cacophony of the battle at the chamber's entrance was a storm of desperation, a brutal symphony of shattering shields and dwarf cries against the relentless, dissonant hum of the guardians. Each impact against the failing shield wall sent a tremor through the floor that vibrated up through Kalen's bones, a constant physical distraction from the immense task before him. His hands hovered over the cold, silent metal of the great bell, his spirit recoiling from the void he felt within it. He was trying to pour his energy into that void, to offer his own life force as a spark, but it was like trying to fill a bottomless well with a single cup of water. The crack was not a seam in the metal, it was a gash in reality itself, and his individual effort was simply too small, too finite, to bridge it. A cold despair began to seep into him, the fear that Boren's brave stand and all their sacrifices would be for nothing. It was Lyra's hand on his arm that pulled him back from the edge of that despair. Her touch was not gentle, but insistent, her fingers digging into his sleeve as she pulled him away from the bell. Her face, illuminated by the flickering, angry light of the battle, was not panicked, but a light with a frantic, brilliant intensity. She had to shout directly into his ear to be heard over the din. Stop, you are trying to fill it, but it has no vessel to hold your offering. The cup is broken, Kalin. The form is there, but the essence is shattered. She gestured wildly at the web of solidified echoes that encased the bell. We have been thinking like smiths, trying to mend a physical break. This is not a break. It is a discord in its very being, a tear in the song that gives it form. Her words cut through his desperation with the clarity of a perfectly struck note. He saw it then, not with his eyes, but with his understanding. The crack was merely the physical manifestation of a far deeper wound. The bell's harmonic essence, the complex, interwoven spiritual frequency that was its true self had been fractured. Pouring raw energy into it was like trying to heal a severed nerve by flooding the body with blood. The life was there, but it had no pathway, no connection. The solidified echoes were not a cage, they were a scar, a failed attempt by the bell's own magic to bind its catastrophic injury. "We cannot force it to accept our energy," Lyra yelled, her voice straining. "We must harmonize with its broken pieces. We must find the fragments of its original song that are still trapped in this web of scars, and we must sing them back together." Her proposal was both terrifying and sublime. She was not suggesting a repair from the outside, but a rebirth from within. They would not be craftsmen mending a tool. They would be healers performing a spiritual surgery, using their own voices as sonic needles to stitch the bell's shattered soul back into a whole. They would have to blend their living spirits with the bell's ancient, dormant magic, becoming temporary vessels for its lost song in order to remind it of what it was. "This is echo magic," she said, her eyes locked on his, pleading for him to understand the depth of her meaning, not capturing sound, but becoming sound. "We must open ourselves completely. We must let go of our individual selves and let the memory of the bell's song flow through us. Our voices will be the loom, and the scattered echoes will be the thread. But we must be in perfect harmony, not just with each other, but with the intention behind every note. If our spirits are not aligned, if there is doubt or fear or selfishness, our voices will create a new dissonance that could shatter what little remains forever." The risk was absolute. They were proposing to not just fix an object, but to intertwine their very beings with a fundamental force of the mountain, with no guarantee they could ever fully pull themselves back out. The battle at the gate was for time. The duel they were about to fight was for the soul of Khazad-dûm itself, and their weapons would be nothing but faith and song. The air in the chamber was thick with the clash of battle and the oppressive silence of the broken bell, two opposing forces warring for dominance. Kaelen and Lyra stood between them, a fragile bridge across an impossible divide. Lyra's revelation had shifted the very ground beneath their feet. This was no longer a forging, but a healing that required them to become instruments themselves. With a final, shared look that held all their fear, hope, and trust, they turned to the task. Kalin raised his hammer, not with the force of a smith, but with the precise intention of a conductor's baton. Lyra closed her eyes, drawing a breath that seemed to draw in the very memory of the mountain. The first strike was not an impact, but a question. Kalen's hammer, its renewed purpose flowing through the ancient wood and metal, touched the cold surface of the bell with a gentle, almost tentative tap. The sound it produced was not a ring, but a dull, dead thud, the sound of hope striking a void, but that was the point. It was a call into the emptiness. And as that pathetic sound faded, Lyra answered it. Her voice, clear and steady despite the surrounding chaos, rose in a single, pure note. It was a note from the oldest of the melodies she had studied, a fragment of the foundational song used to align new cast bells. She did not sing at the bell. She sang into the space the strike had created, offering her voice as a vessel for what was lost. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing happened. The dissonant roar of the guardians and the shouts of the dwarves seemed to mock their fragile effort. Then, a single, shimmering thread within the web of solidified echoes flickered, catching Lyra's note like a dewdrop catching the dawn light. It glowed, a faint pulse of gold in the sickly web. Encouraged, Kaelen struck again, a fraction harder, on a different point along the bell's rim, guided by an instinct he didn't know he possessed. This time, Lyra's voice shifted, weaving a more complex sequence, a harmonic response to the new vibration he had created. Another thread in the web ignited, and then another, each one resonating with a specific frequency from her song. They were not performing a predetermined piece. They were having a conversation with a ghost. Kalin would strike, listening not just with his ears, but with his spirit for the faintest echo of a response from within the bell's core. And Lyra would instantly interpret that subtle feedback and answer with a new melodic phrase, pulling another lost fragment of the bell's song from the web of scars. His hammer became her metronome, her voice his guide. He was not just striking metal, he was striking the echoes themselves, using the hammer as a tuning device to physically vibrate the solidified sound, while Lyra's voice provided the intentionality, the emotional and spiritual context that gave the vibrations meaning. The web began to thrum, no longer a static cage, but a dynamic, living lattice of light and sound. The individual glowing threads started to weave themselves back together, drawn by the magnetic pull of their harmony. The jagged crack in the bell's side began to emit a soft, silver light from within, as if the metal itself was remembering its purpose. The process was painfully slow. Each note demanded absolute focus, a perfect unity of intent between them. A moment of doubt, a flicker of distraction from the battle behind them, and the nascent harmony would waver, the glowing threads dimming, threatening to collapse back into dissonance. Their partnership, tested in the caves and on the bridge, was now being forged in the most intense crucible imaginable. But with each successful exchange, their confidence grew and their connection deepened. They were no longer two separate beings, but a single entity with a shared purpose. Kaelen could anticipate the next note Lyra needed to sing by the feel of the vibration through his hammer. Lyra could sense where Kaelen needed to strike next by the slight shift in the harmonic atmosphere around the bell. The forgotten melodies were not being recalled from scrolls anymore. They were being remembered by the bell itself, and Lyra was merely the channel through which that memory could flow back into the world. The chamber, once filled with the sounds of conflict and the chill of absence, began to be permeated by something new, something ancient and powerful and beautiful. It was the sound of a dawn long overdue, the first faint, trembling notes of a song that had been silent for an age, finally finding its voice again through theirs. The dissonant roar that had filled the chamber, a terrifying symphony of conflict and ancient wrath, did not so much cease as it was transformed. The aggressive, jarring frequencies that had defined the Guardian's assault began to soften, their jagged edges smoothed away by the emerging harmony flowing from the bell. The shift was not instantaneous but gradual, like a storm cloud breaking apart to let the sun through. The beings of solidified sound, once coiled and sharp with destructive intent, slowed their advance. Their forms, which had been a chaotic whirl of distorted light and angry vibration, began to still, their outlines softening from weapons into something resembling shields. The violent pulses of force they had been directing at the dwarf line weakened, then dissolved entirely, replaced by a deep, resonant hum that was no longer a threat, but an acknowledgement. The shield wall, braced for the next crushing impact, held its position in bewildered silence. The clansmen, their muscles tensed for a death blow that never came, slowly lowered their weapons, their faces etched with a confusion that quickly gave way to sheer, unadulterated awe. The Guardians were not retreating, they were listening. Their entire beings seemed to be reorienting, turning from the dwarves toward the source of the new, healing music. As Kalen's hammer fell in perfect time, and Lyra's voice wove the ancient melodies into the air, the guardians began to resonate in sympathy. Their dissonant hum tuned itself, matching the foundational notes of the bell's restoring song, layer upon layer of harmony, adding itself to the choir until the chamber was no longer filled with the noise of battle, but with a profound, complex chord of immense power and peace. Elder Boren, his axe hanging loosely from his hand, could only watch, his breath caught in his chest. The terrifying sentinels of his deepest fears were now aligning themselves around the chamber's perimeter, their forms shifting from amorphous blurs of anger into statuesque, noble figures of light and crystal-infused sound. They stood like silent, vigilant knights, their attention no longer on the intruders, but on the bell itself, their purpose seamlessly transitioning from destruction to preservation. They were not just ceasing their attack, they were assuming their true, original role as guardians of the song, not the silence, and as they settled into their protective stations, the very chamber responded to the restored harmony. The crystals embedded in the walls and ceiling, which had glowed with a faint, dormant light, now blazed to life. Prisms of amethyst, sapphire, and gold erupted from the geodes, casting dancing, intricate patterns across the obsidian floor and the faces of the stunned onlookers. The hall was no longer a tomb of cold stone and darker memories. It was a cathedral of living light and reborn sound, every surface vibrating with the music it had been designed to amplify and cherish. The air itself felt different, charged, alive, and thrumming with a potential that had been asleep for 1,000 years. The final note did not come from the hammer or the voice alone, but from the space where their two spirits met and merged into a single, unified intention. It was a convergence of all they were, and all they had learned, Kalen's unwavering belief, given physical form in the strike, Lyra's profound understanding given wings in the song. They did not force the energy out, they released it, a single, selfless offering of their combined essence into the heart of the waiting metal. For a heartbeat that stretched into an eternity, there was only a profound, suspended silence, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. Then the light that had been gathering within the bell's crack erupted, not as an explosion, but as a wave of pure, liquid silver that flowed over the entire surface, sealing the fracture without a seam, leaving the metal flawless and gleaming as if newborn. And then it rang. The sound was not loud in the way a clap of thunder is loud. It was immense. It was a fundamental vibration that originated not in the chamber, but in the fabric of reality itself. It was the first true note, the platonic ideal of a ring, so pure and clear that it seemed to wash the very air clean of all past discord. The wave of sound hit them physically, a warm, palpable force that passed through their bodies, through the stone under their feet, and out into the endless tunnels of Khazad-dûm. The crystal walls of the chamber did not merely amplify it, they sang with it, every geode and prism erupting into a coruscating blaze of light that pulsed in perfect time with the bell's enduring tone. The effect on the world around them was immediate and miraculous. Deep within the stone, long dormant mechanisms of ancient magic, starved for centuries, stirred awake. Veins of mithril and gold, embedded in the rock miles away, began to glow with a soft, internal light. In forgotten halls, patches of luminous moss that had faded to a dull gray suddenly flared back into a vibrant, healthy blue. Far above, In the dwelling chambers of the clan, dwarves stopped their work mid-motion. A miner's pick hung in the air before its swing. A smith's hammer paused above the glowing metal on the anvil. They felt it not in their ears, but in their chests, a deep, resonant thrum that was at once utterly foreign and hauntingly familiar, a memory from a dream they'd all shared but could never quite recall. It was a vibration that spoke to something deep in their blood, a connection to their history that had been severed and was now suddenly, shockingly, whole again. The echo did not fade. It traveled, and as it traveled, it awakened replies. From a deep chasm to the east, a smaller, higher chime answered, a clear, sweet note that had been silent since the fall of the eastern holds. From a sealed treasury chamber, a set of harmonic crystal plates began to vibrate in sympathy, producing a complex, shimmering chord. It was a chain reaction of sound, a network of harmonic magic, re-establishing itself after an age of silence. Each answering note added a new layer to the symphony, building a complex tapestry of resonance that wove through the stone, healing fractures not just in the rock, but in the very soul of the Dwarven people. The long silence was over. The song of the mountain had returned, and its first note was a declaration that the heart of Khazad-dûm still beat strong and true. The first clear ring of the great bell did not fade into silence. It expanded. It was a living thing, a wave of pure, foundational energy that traveled not just through the air, but through the very stone of the mountain, a vibration that seeped into the deepest bones of Khazad-dûm. It moved through seams of ore, along ancient watercourses, and up the roots of subterranean fungi, carrying with it a single, undeniable message. The heart was beating again. And as that primary wave of sound radiated outward, it began to wake the echoes of all that had been sleeping. From the dark, abandoned chambers of the eastern delves, a faint, answering chime trembled into being, a high, silvery note that had not been heard since the days of the first migrations. Deep within a sealed library, a set of harmonic crystal plates, long thought to be mere decorations, began to hum a complex, interweaving chord, their vibrations cleaning centuries of dust from their surfaces. In the old refectory hall, where generations had once gathered, the acoustic stones embedded in the ceiling resonated with a deep, comforting thrum. The memory of laughter and song suddenly made real again. For the dwarves standing in the chamber of the bell, and for their kin far above in the inhabited halls, the experience was not merely auditory. It was a seismic shift in their very being. The clansmen who had held the line against the Guardians felt the wave pass through them, and the aches of their bruises and the fear in their hearts were washed away, replaced by a profound, tingling warmth. Elder Boren, his face still streaked with the grime of battle, felt the vibration in the old wound on his shoulder, a chronic ache from a long-ago mine collapse, and to his astonishment, the pain simply vanished. But more than any physical sensation, it was an emotional and spiritual awakening. The deep, nagging doubt that had been a constant companion to every dwarf, the unspoken fear that their greatest days were behind them, that they were merely caretakers of a fading glory, that doubt shattered like glass. In its place bloomed a dizzying, powerful wonder. This was not a story from a dusty scroll. This was not a grandfather's wistful tale. This was real. The magic was real, and it was theirs. It belonged to them. This surge of connection was more than just pride. It was a remembering. A young apprentice smith, high in the upper forges, suddenly understood the purpose of a peculiar twisting technique he'd struggled to learn, seeing in his mind's eye the ghost of a master using it to inlay mithril in a resonant pattern. A cook in the kitchens, pulling bread from an oven, felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to add a certain rare spice to the dough, a tradition lost for 5 generations, because in that moment she could almost smell it on the air of a bustling hall from a forgotten time. It was as if the bell's ring had been a key, unlocking a door in the collective memory of their people. They were not separate individuals in a slow decline. They were notes in a continuous, unbroken song that had only skipped a beat that had now been found again. Their purpose, which had narrowed to survival and maintenance, suddenly exploded outward into a vast and thrilling horizon of discovery. They were the heirs not to a corpse, but to a slumbering giant, and they had just heard it take its first breath. The work was not over, it had just begun, and for the first time in centuries, every dwarf in Khazad-dûm knew exactly what they had to do. The immense wave of energy that had flowed from Kalin into the bell did not simply stop when the note faded. It left a void in its wake, a profound emptiness where his spirit had been. The focus that had sustained him through the forging, the climb, the fear, and the final, transcendent act of harmony evaporated all at once, like a mist burned away by the sun. His legs, which had been pillars of unwavering resolve, turned to water. The world tilted on its axis, the glorious light of the crystal chamber swimming into a blur of color and sound. He felt himself falling, a slow, weightless drift into a deep and welcoming darkness, the exhaustion of body and soul finally claiming its due, but he did not meet the cold, hard stone. Strong arms caught him, halting his collapse with a firm, steady grip. Lyra, her own face pale with the effort of their shared song, held him upright, her body braced against his weight. She eased him down gently until he was sitting, slumped against the warm, humming bass of the great bell itself. For a long moment, there were no words. The only sounds were his ragged, shallow breathing and the fading, heavenly echoes that still shimmered in the air around them. He looked up at her, his vision clearing slowly, and saw not the weary, skeptical exile or the frantic scholar, but a partner etched with the same awe and bone-deep fatigue that he felt. In her eyes, he saw the reflection of their impossible triumph, and a silent, overwhelming understanding passed between them. They had done it. Against all odds, warnings, and reason, they had reached into the silence and pulled a song back from the brink of forever. It was in this shared, breathless silence that the guardians made their final gesture. The noble, luminous forms that had stood sentinel around the chamber, their purpose now utterly fulfilled, turned their focus from the bell to the 2 dwarves at its base. There was no malice in their gaze, no lingering trace of their former wrath. Instead, their shimmering, sound-woven forms seemed to soften further, adopting a posture of deep, unmistakable reverence. As one, they inclined their heads in a slow, deliberate bow, a gesture of respect not to a conqueror, but to a rightful heir. They were acknowledging the keepers of the song, the ones who had not broken the mountain's heart, but had mended it. Their vigil, held across the lonely centuries, was finally over. Having bestowed this final sign of recognition, their forms began to dissolve, not vanishing abruptly, but fading with the gentle grace of a concluding chord. They melted back into the very stone from which they had been composed, their light absorbed by the crystal walls, their presence returning to the patient, waiting mountain. They were not gone, they were simply at rest, their duty complete, their trust placed in new hands. The chamber was theirs alone, filled now only with peace, the enduring song of the bell, and the quiet, triumphant exhaustion of a promise kept. The profound silence that followed the bell's first pure note was not an absence of sound, but a space filled with awe. It was in this sacred quiet that Elder Boren finally moved. He did not stride forward with the authority of his station, but walked slowly, almost hesitantly, his heavy boots making no sound on the gleaming obsidian floor. The anger and fear that had lined his face for so long had been washed away by the bell's cleansing resonance, leaving behind something raw and deeply humbled. He stopped a few paces from where Kalin sat, supported by Lyra, and for a long moment, he simply looked at the great bell, his eyes tracing its flawless, singing form as if seeing it for the first time. When he finally spoke, his voice, usually a tool of command, was soft, layered with a reverence that seemed to vibrate in harmony with the chamber itself. "I have spent my entire life," he began, the words measured and heavy with confession, "believing that my duty was to protect our people from the past. I thought the old songs were a danger, a pride that could only lead to ruin. I believed the silence was our safety." He turned his gaze from the bell to Kaelen, and then to Lyra, his expression one of profound, weary gratitude. "I was a fool. I was guarding a tomb and calling it wisdom. You did not awaken a danger, you awakened us." This was no simple apology. It was a fundamental rewriting of his life's creed. He admitted that his fear was not of the mountain's ancient magic, but of the responsibility. It demanded the courage to be more than just caretakers of a fading echo, to become active participants in a living legacy. He had been afraid to hope, because hope required the risk of failure, a risk he had deemed too great for his people to bear. But in their reckless, glorious success, Kaelen and Lyra had shown him that the greater risk was in letting their spirit wither entirely. The value of the past was not in its perfection, but in its potential, a blueprint not for repetition, but for renewal. His offer, when it came, was not delivered as a decree from an elder, but as a request from one dwarf to two others. He turned fully to Lyra, his posture open, his hands usually clasped in authority, held loose at his sides. "Your exile was our failure, Lore Keeper Lyra," he said, giving her the title she had earned and been denied for so long. "We punished curiosity because we mistook it for recklessness. We condemned your methods because we were too afraid to understand them. I cannot undo the years you have spent in the shadows, but I can offer you a place not just back in the clan, but at the very heart of it. Your knowledge is not a heresy, it is our most vital guide. The archives will be open to you, and a new hall of learning will be established, with you as its master. Your work will be the foundation upon which we rebuild our understanding." Then he looked to Kaelen, who was slowly finding his strength again. "And you, Kaelen Stone Singer," Boren said, using a name that had not been spoken until that very moment, a title born from the act they had just witnessed. "Your forge will be the finest in Khazad-dûm. You will have every resource, every apprentice who shows an ear for the old harmonies. Your work will not be a lonely pursuit, but the honored craft of our people, central to our life and our future." This was more than support. It was a coronation of spirit. Boren was not just approving their quest. He was formally integrating their radical, life-giving work into the very fabric of Dwarven society. ensuring that the song they had reignited would never be allowed to fade again through neglect or fear. It was the end of their rebellion and the beginning of their legacy. The journey back to the upper halls was nothing like the desperate, secretive climb downward. They did not creep through disused conduits or navigate lethal silences. They walked, a solemn and weary procession, through the main thoroughfares of Khazad-dûm, and the mountain itself seemed to welcome them home. The deep, resonant tone of the great bell had not faded. It had settled into the stone, a permanent, gentle hum that vibrated through the floor and up into the bones of every dwarf they passed. It was a sound felt more than heard, a constant, comforting reminder that the heart of the mountain was beating once more. As they ascended, the evidence of the bell's awakening became ever more apparent. Patches of luminous moss that had glowed a feeble gray now shone with a vibrant, healthy blue. Seams of crystal embedded in the walls pulsed with a soft, internal light, and the very air felt clearer, easier to breathe, as if a stifling blanket of dust had been lifted from the entire stronghold. Word of their approach traveled faster than their footsteps. By the time they reached the main dwelling caverns, a crowd had already begun to gather. It was not a raucous, cheering mob, but a quiet, awe-struck assembly. Dwarves emerged from their workshops and homes, their faces etched not with curiosity, but with a profound, trembling wonder. They did not shout questions or demands. They simply stood and watched the group walk past, their eyes wide, their hands often pressed to their chests or the stone walls, feeling the new old vibration that thrummed through everything. They looked at Kalin, not with the suspicion or dismissal he had known his entire life, but with a reverence that made him deeply uncomfortable. He saw smiths with soot still on their faces, miners with rock dust in their beards, mothers holding children on their hips, all gazing at him as if he were a figure from a legend stepped out of a song. He was no longer Kaelen, the reckless dreamer. He was the dwarf who had mended the unmendable, who had answered the silent longing in every heart. He was a restorer. Elder Boren, walking firmly at the front of the group, understood the moment's significance. He did not need to command attention. He had it utterly. He stopped in the center of the main concourse, the natural gathering place of the clan, and turned to face his people. His voice, when he spoke, carried easily in the acoustically perfect space, but he did not shout. He spoke with a gravity and a warmth that held the entire crowd spellbound. He told them of the deep halls, not as a place of terror, but as a place of memory. He spoke of the guardians, not as monsters, but as protectors who had recognized their rightful purpose. And he spoke of Kaelen and Lyra, not as exiles or rebels, but as heroes who had wielded not weapons, but wisdom and courage to heal a wound that had festered for an age. He formally rescinded Lyra's exile, naming her the chief lore keeper of the renewed Hall of Echoes, and he hailed Kaelen as Master Bellmaker, the restorer of the great song. The approval that washed over them was a physical force, a wave of collective relief and joy that was louder than any cheer. But as hands clapped him on the back and voices called his new name, Kaelen Stone Singer, he felt a sudden, crushing weight settle on his shoulders. The simple, pure goal that had driven him, find the bell, fix the bell, was accomplished, but in its place was a vast, sprawling, and terrifying new reality. He was no longer working for himself or for a dream. He was working for them, for every dwarf who looked at him now with unwavering faith. They expected him to not only understand the magic he had somehow performed, but to replicate it, to teach it, to build a new future upon it. The freedom of his lonely quest was gone, replaced by the responsibility of being a symbol. He had wanted to hear the song. Now he was expected to conduct the entire orchestra, with no idea how to read the music. The smiles around him felt like chains, and the weight of their hope was heavier than any stone he had ever lifted. He had succeeded in every way, and in doing so, he had built his own gilded cage of expectation. The weight of expectation did not crush them. Instead, it became the anvil upon which they forged their next great work. Their first act as acknowledged masters was not to build a monument or cast a new bell, but to found something far more enduring, a new guild. They chose a name that spoke to both the past and the future, the Guild of Resonant Hearts. It was housed not in some grand, newly carved hall, but in the very same forgotten forge where Kalin had first heard the hum that started it all. They believed the space itself, steeped in that initial spark of lonely curiosity, would serve as the perfect reminder of where true discovery begins. This was not to be a place of dusty dogma and rigid techniques passed down without question. Its core principle, etched above the entrance in runes both old and new, was a simple, radical idea: to listen is to learn. Their approach to teaching was as revolutionary as their quest had been. They did not separate theory from practice, or lore from labor. Apprentices selected not for their family name or sheer strength, but for a discernible sensitivity to sound and vibration, spent their mornings with Lyra in a makeshift library of reclaimed tablets and her own hastily scribbled notes. But this was no quiet study. She taught them to feel the history in the stone, to read the harmonic patterns in the way water dripped in a cavern, to understand that echo magic was not a set of spells to be memorized, but a language of the mountain itself, a language they had to learn to speak with empathy and respect. They learned the tragic stories of the corrupt cabal, not as a warning to avoid power, but as a vital lesson in the ethical responsibility that comes with wielding it. Their afternoons were spent with Kaelen at the forge, but they rarely struck a hammer for their first month. Instead, he had them hold different metals, from common iron to rare star shards, and simply listen. They learned to identify the unique, faint song each metal held within it, understanding that a bell's voice begins long before the casting, in the inherent resonance of its raw materials. A student might spend a week tuning a single small plate to a specific, perfect pitch, learning that precision is a form of reverence. The first time, a young dwarf named Lyra, her hands still unsure, managed to strike a note so pure it made a dormant crystal chime in sympathy from across the room. The entire forge fell silent. The look of astonished joy on her face was not just a personal triumph. It was the future of the craft taking root, and it was more powerful than any perfectly cast bell. Kaelen and Lyra quickly realized they were not just teaching skills, they were fostering a new culture. The old ways had prized solitary mastery and secret techniques, guarded jealously within bloodlines. The Guild of Resonant Hearts, however, was built on collaboration. Apprentices worked in pairs, one striking a tone while the other listened for the subtle harmonics and imperfections, learning that the true measure of a sound is often heard best by another. They were taught that a flaw was not a failure to be hidden, but a dissonance to be understood and learned from, a conversation starter with the material itself. The forge rang with the sounds of experimentation, of occasional discordant clangs that were met not with scorn, but with collective analysis, as the entire group would work together to diagnose what intention had been misaligned in the strike. This was the ultimate safeguard against the silence returning. It was not the great bell, mighty as it was, that would ensure the song endured. It was this: dozens of young minds being taught not what to think, but how to listen. It was ensuring that the knowledge was no longer held in one or two pairs of hands, but woven into a community, a living network of understanding that could not be so easily broken. They were creating a chorus, not a soloist, and in the quiet moments, when Kalin heard a group of apprentices laughing as they tried to harmonize their breathing to steady their hammer strokes, he felt the weight on his shoulders finally begin to lift. It was no longer his burden to carry alone. He was teaching others how to share the weight, and in doing so, the melody grew stronger than any one dwarf could ever make it. Months had settled into a steady rhythm within the Guild of Resonant Hearts, a cadence defined by the ring of hammers on newly cast tuning plates and the low, constant hum of scholarly debate. The great bell's song had become the mountain's new heartbeat, a foundational tone so integrated into daily life that the dwarves now felt its absence only in the rare moments of utter stillness, a ghost of the old silence they could scarcely remember. Kaelen and Lyra had fallen into the deep, satisfying work of building their legacy not in stone, but in minds, watching with pride as their first apprentices began to develop their own unique affinities, some for the deep, grounding frequencies of iron, others for the ethereal, high harmonies of crystal. The work felt complete, a closed circle of restoration and renewal. They believed their great journey was over, and that the future was now a matter of careful, patient cultivation. This comfortable certainty was shattered one evening during a routine calibration. Lyra, the young apprentice whose first pure note had been a milestone for the guild, was practicing with a massive, disc-shaped plate of bronze, a listening device of Lyra's design that was tuned to absorb and amplify the faintest of distant vibrations. It was an exercise in focus, meant to teach the students to separate the mountain's constant hum from the myriad of smaller, incidental sounds within it. The drip of water, the shift of stone, the distant rumble of the forges. Her brow was furrowed in concentration, her hands gently pressed against the cool metal when she suddenly stiffened. Her eyes, which had been closed, flew open, wide with confusion. "Master Lyra," she called out, her voice cutting through the low chatter of the workshop. "There's a new note. It's not one of ours." Lyra was at her side in an instant, placing her own palms flat on the bronze disc. Kalin joined them, a curious frown on his face. For a long moment, there was nothing but the familiar, comforting thrum of Khazad-dûm. Then they all felt it, a faint, impossibly distant tremor that ran through the metal. It was not a random vibration. It was structured, a sequence of 3 low pulses, followed by a higher, sustained tone that faded with a deliberate, melodic sigh. It was a phrase, a greeting. It echoed the foundational harmonic pattern of their own great bell, but it was distinct, older, woven with a different musical dialect they had never heard before. It was a voice from the dark, a whisper on a wind that had been still for 1,000 years. The workshop fell utterly silent, every apprentice and master freezing in place, their own tasks forgotten. All eyes were fixed on the bronze disc, waiting, The signal did not repeat immediately. The silence that followed was agonizing, filled with the terrifying possibility that it had been a trick of the mountain, a fleeting anomaly. But then, after a span of heartbeats that felt like an age, it came again. The same 3 pulses, the same sustained tone, a little stronger this time, as if whatever was sending it had also been listening, adjusting, strengthening its call. It was a sound that should not have been possible. The other ancient holds were not just silent. They were myths, their locations lost, their halls presumed collapsed or so deeply buried that not even an echo could escape. Lyra's mind, ever the scholar's, was the first to break from the stupor of awe. She began rattling off theories, her words tumbling over one another in her excitement. The bell's ring, it wasn't just a sound, it was a catalyst. It didn't just travel through rock, it traveled through the foundation of the magic itself. The harmonic network the ancients built, it was never destroyed. It was dormant, like a root system waiting for a spring rain. Our bell was the rain. She theorized that the great Dwarven holds of old were not Chinese letter islands of culture, but points on a vast, interconnected web of resonant energy, designed to allow communication and shared power across continents. The silence of one had caused a cascading failure, a great unraveling that left each hold isolated and fading. But the reactivation of the primary heart, the great bell of Boren, had sent a surge of power through that dead network, and somewhere, far to the east or north, another heart had stirred in its sleep, felt the connection, and whispered back. The implications were staggering, unfolding in their minds like a map of a world they thought they knew, now suddenly revealed to be twice as large and infinitely more mysterious. This was more than a simple message. It was an invitation. It was proof that they were not alone, that the Dwarven spirit had endured in other pockets of the world, other bastions of stone that had also been waiting in the silence. The quest to restore Khazad-dûm's song was complete, but in its place, 1,000 new quests presented themselves. Where did the signal originate? Was it from the fabled Iron Hills, or the legendary halls of the Red Mountains? Was it an automated echo of a long-dead hold, a ghost in the machine, or was it a deliberate signal from living dwarves who had just felt their own mountain shudder awake with a forgotten song? For Kalin, who had grown accustomed to the weight of expectation, this new discovery replaced it with a dizzying, exhilarating sense of scope. His journey had never been about looking back. It had been about listening for a future he believed was possible. And now the future had answered. It meant that their work, their guild, their hard-won knowledge was not a final destination. It was a beginning. They were not just restorers of a single song. They were the first node in a reborn network, the keepers of a flame that could now be passed to others. The path ahead was no longer a deep descent into the mountain's belly, but a horizontal journey across the wide world, a calling to seek out other lost echoes and offer them the same gift of remembrance. The silence had been broken, and in its place arose not just a song, but a conversation spanning unimaginable distances, waiting for its next word to be spoken. The deep, resonant song of the great bell had become the new bedrock of life in Khazad-dûm, a constant, comforting vibration woven into the stone, the air, and the very rhythm of the dwarves' hearts. For Kaelen, however, its call was more personal, a quiet summons that often drew him away from the busy guild forges and the eager questions of his apprentices. He would walk the now familiar path down to the crystal-lit chamber, not as a trespasser or a desperate hero, but as a visitor to an old friend. The journey itself was a meditation, each step a movement away from the weight of his new title: Master Bellmaker, Stone Singer, Restorer, and a return to the simple dwarf who had once heard a lonely hum in a dusty workshop. Standing before the magnificent bell, its surface gleaming with a soft, internal light, he would simply listen. He did not come to study its harmonics or analyze its frequency as Lyra might. He came to remember. The bell's enduring song was a living tapestry, and in its complex weave, he could still hear the echoes of their entire journey. The clear, high note at the crest of each ring was Lyra's voice, steady and sure, weaving the lost melodies back into being. The deep, foundational thrum that followed was the courage of Boren and the clansmen, their shield wall against the darkness. And the gentle, sustaining resonance that held it all together felt like the quiet, approving presence of the ancestors themselves, their long vigil finally at peace. In these moments of solitude, the immense pressure of his new role would soften. The expectations of the clan, the endless decisions of the guild, the daunting knowledge that he was now the standard bearer for a forgotten art, it all shrank to a manageable size against the bell's timeless music. He reflected on how it had all begun, not with a grand plan or a prophecy, but with a single, stubborn act of belief. A belief that a faint sound was worth following, that a forgotten story was worth remembering, that a broken thing was worth mending. He had not set out to change his world. He had only wanted to answer a question that haunted him. Yet, that one simple choice, held onto against all fear and reason, had cascaded into a transformation that reshaped the destiny of his entire people. He now understood that the ancestors were not distant, stone-faced legends in a hall. They were present in every vibration, in every choice to create rather than destroy, to hope rather than fear. Their guidance was not a voice from the past, but a resonance in the present, a nudge toward courage when faced with a difficult teaching, a spark of intuition when a casting did not go as planned, a sense of profound peace when he simply stood and listened. They were not dictating his path. They were harmonizing with it, adding their strength to his own, just as Lyra's voice had harmonized with his hammer strike to heal the great crack. The bell's song was a constant reminder that he was never truly working alone, that every act of genuine creation is a collaboration across time, a note added to an eternal melody that others would one day continue. And so, he would leave the chamber each time not burdened, but renewed, the bell's music echoing in his steps, a quiet promise to keep listening, keep learning, and keep adding his own unique verse to the unending song of the mountain. The quiet solitude of Lyra's new study was a world away from the bustling activity of the guild forges, yet it was here, surrounded by teetering stacks of reclaimed stone tablets and the soft rustle of fresh parchment, that the next great work of Khazad-dûm began to take shape. It was not forged from metal, but from memory and meticulous insight. The treatise began not as a grand ambition to cement her legacy, but as a simple, practical necessity. With dozens of new apprentices now looking to her for guidance, she found herself repeating the same explanations, sketching the same harmonic diagrams, and recounting the same foundational stories from the deep archives. She needed a reference, a single, comprehensive source that could capture the vast and intricate tapestry of knowledge they were all trying to rebuild. And so, she took up her stylus, not for a personal project, but as a service to the future she and Kalin were fighting to create. What emerged over the following months, however, became so much more than a mere textbook. It became a living bridge across time. Lyra possessed a unique genius for this work, a mind that could hold two seemingly opposing truths in perfect balance. On one hand, she treated the ancient lore with the reverence of the most devout lore keeper, painstakingly copying runes from crumbling tablets and preserving every faded whisper of the old master's techniques with absolute fidelity. She would spend days ensuring the precise angle of a single, crucial rune was reproduced without error, understanding that in echo magic, a symbol's shape was as much a part of its sonic identity as the note it represented. This was not blind worship of the past. It was the essential work of an archivist, saving the scattered pieces of a shattered vase so it could one day be whole again. But her true revolution lay on the other side of that balance. She did not simply present these ancient truths as immutable laws to be obeyed. She annotated them. She questioned them. In the margins of her beautiful, rune-etched diagrams, she would add notes from her own disastrous experiments in the lower halls, detailing exactly what frequency had been a fraction too sharp and what the catastrophic result had been. She included Kaelin's intuitive, forge-born discoveries alongside the rigorous theoretical frameworks, showing how a master smith's feel for a metal song could sometimes achieve what a perfect equation could not. She called it the Symphony of Stone and Spirit, a living dialogue with echo, and the title itself was a declaration of her new philosophy. Magic was not a monologue delivered by the past. It was a conversation, a dynamic interplay between unchanging principles and the living, breathing intention of the practitioner. The act of writing became a profound and unexpected healing for the wounds of her exile. Every time she detailed a past failure, she was not confessing a shameful secret. She was transforming it into a vital lesson for an apprentice she would never meet. The rockfall caused by her youthful hubris was no longer a private ghost that haunted her hands. In the pages of her treatise, it became the principle of calculated resonance, the foundational warning upon which all safe practice was built. Her regret was alchemized into responsibility. The scorn and dismissal she had endured from the old council were smoothed away by the sheer, tangible value of the work she was now producing. With every page, she was building a new orthodoxy, one not of fear and prohibition, but of fearless curiosity, grounded in hard-won wisdom. When the final page was etched, and the last diagram inlaid with shimmering dust to denote harmonic pathways, the completed work was placed not on a secluded shelf, but on a great stone lectern in the heart of the Guild of Resonant Hearts. It was not meant to be a relic to be revered from a distance, but a tool to be used, its pages handled by hands stained with forged soot, and its margins filled with new notes from the next generation of seekers. Elders who had once called her work dangerous heresy now came to study its pages, their nods of grudging respect slowly turning into genuine admiration for the depth of her scholarship. Young apprentices, struggling to find the right pitch for their first tuning crystal, would find not just an instruction, but a story of another apprentice who had struggled too, and the encouragement to try again. Lyra's legacy was thus solidified, not in a moment of dramatic triumph, but in the quiet, daily rhythm of learning and discovery that now pulsed through the mountain. Her name was no longer whispered as a cautionary tale of what happened to those who asked too many questions. It was spoken with respect as the author of their new beginning, the cartographer who had drawn the first reliable maps for a world they were all just learning to navigate. She had taken the scattered, broken echoes of a lost age and weaved them into a coherent score, ensuring that the song of the dwarves would never again be a forgotten melody, but a symphony that each new generation could learn, play, and ultimately enrich with their own unique verses. The stability they had fought so hard to achieve was not a permanent state, but a delicate balance, a song that required constant, conscious participation from the mountain itself. For months, the great bell's ring had been a steady, reassuring constant, its vibration as reliable as the stone beneath their feet. But deep magic has its own tides and currents, and a foundation that has been cracked, even when perfectly healed, remembers the trauma. The first sign was a subtle one, noticed only by those whose lives were now dedicated to listening. During a routine harmonic mapping of the upper halls, Lyra's most sensitive crystal receptors picked up a faint, irregular flutter in the bell's core frequency, a vibration out of sync with itself, like a heart stumbling over a beat. She dismissed it at first as an anomaly, a trick of the deep currents, but the next day it was stronger, and the day after that, an apprentice placing his hand on the bell's stand jerked it back with a gasp, reporting not the usual warm hum, but a jarring, cold dissonance that felt like a betrayal. The truth revealed itself with terrifying speed. The initial repair, for all its miraculous success, had been an act of emergency healing, a binding of spirit to a profound wound. But the bell's song was not a static thing. It was a living, dynamic force that interacted with the mountain's own immense energies. A deep-seated instability, a flaw in the underlying magical strata that had caused the original catastrophe, had begun to reassert its pressure. The great crack was not reappearing in the metal. Instead, the song itself was beginning to tear apart from the inside, the harmonies they had woven together starting to unravel under a strain older than history. The bell wasn't just going silent, it was on the verge of a catastrophic harmonic collapse, an event that wouldn't just break the bell, but would likely shatter the entire crystal chamber and trigger a chain reaction of cave-ins throughout the lower depths. The very act of saving their home was now about to destroy it. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. As the chamber began to shudder, fine cracks spider webbing across the magnificent geodes in the ceiling, Kaelen and Lyra faced the horrifying reality. Their tools, their knowledge, even their combined spirits were not enough this time. The flaw was too deep, the required energy too vast. To counter a dissonance of this magnitude, to restabilize a song that was the heart of the mountain, would require a resonance beyond any single dwarf, even any small group. They needed a chorus, not of a few trained keepers, but of everyone. They needed the collective voice of every dwarf in Khazad-dûm, from the youngest child to the eldest elder, all singing with one intention, one hope, one unified breath. It was an impossible idea. The clan had been united in wonder, but could they be united in action so precise, so selfless, under the threat of imminent annihilation? There was no time to gather them, no time to explain the complex harmonic sequence. The only way was to lead them, to use the bell itself as a conduit, and their own spirits as the conductors. Kalin slammed his hammer against the shuddering bell, not to fight the dissonance, but to capture it, to broadcast the jarring, failing frequency throughout the entire mountain. The sound that echoed through the halls was not the familiar warm ring, but a desperate, wavering cry of distress, a scream of pain that vibrated through every stone, every tool, every heart. In the forges, hammers fell silent. In the kitchens, conversations halted. In the deep mines, dwarves looked up from their work, their hands going to the walls, their faces etched with a primal fear. The mountain was crying out. Then Lyra began to sing. She poured every ounce of her being, every fragment of knowledge from her treaties, every memory of their journey, into a single, pure, stabilizing note. It was the foundational tone, the harmonic center around which all else must revolve. She did not sing it loudly, but she sang it with such perfect clarity and unwavering intent that it cut through the dissonance, a slender thread of hope in the roaring chaos. Kaelen, his hand still on the bell, felt her note and joined it with his own voice, a perfect fifth above, strengthening the structure. They stood there, two small figures before a failing giant, singing against the end of all things, their voices a fragile lifeline thrown into a storm. And then another voice joined. It was Elder Boren, his old, gravelly tone rough but steady, adding a deep bass note of solidarity from the entrance to the chamber. Then a clansman who had held the shield wall added his voice, then another and another. The song traveled upward, through the stone, through the air, through the shared fear that suddenly transformed into shared purpose. A mother, holding her frightened child, began to hum the note, rocking gently. A young apprentice in the upper forges, tears in his eyes, opened his mouth and matched the pitch he felt in his bones. A miner, deep in the dark, lifted his head and sang a note that had not passed his lips since his youth. They did not know the theory. They did not know the plan. They only knew that the mountain needed them, and they knew the sound it needed to hear. They knew the song of home, 1 by 1, then 10 by 10, then 100 by 100. Every dwarf in Khazad-dûm added their voice to the chorus. It was not a practiced harmony, but a mighty, roaring wave of unified will. The sound was not pretty in a musical sense. It was raw, powerful, and alive with every emotion: fear, love, determination, memory. This collective energy, this surge of unified spirit, flowed through the stone, drawn to the bell like a river to the sea. It poured into the chamber, not as noise, but as pure, undiluted harmonic force, swirling around Kaelen and Lyra, and flooding into the fracturing song of the bell. Under this immense, loving pressure, the instability met its match. The dissonance did not just stop, it was absorbed, transformed, integrated into the chorus. The bell's shuddering ceased. The cracks in the ceiling stopped spreading. The terrible, tearing sensation in the air smoothed into a profound, powerful, and deeply stable resonance. The note they all sang became the note the bell rang, and the bell's ring became the note they all sang, in a perfect, self-sustaining loop of unity. In that moment, the magic of the mountain did not just belong to the dwarves belonged to the magic. They were no longer its keepers or its users. They were its living, breathing instrument, and it was theirs. The bond was forged not in quiet study, but in shared, desperate action, a connection that would echo in the bloodline of every dwarf present, a silent understanding that their song was literally their strength, and their unity was the greatest magic of all. The echoes now ring steadily through the deep places of Khazad-dûm, a sound that has woven itself into the very stone and soul of the mountain. It is no longer the hesitant, flickering melody of those first few days, but a robust, enduring harmony that pulses through the forges, resonates in the mines, and hums in the quiet of the dwelling halls. This is the new heartbeat of the dwarves, a testament not to a single moment of heroism, but to the profound and lasting power of courage found in the face of fear, and collaboration forged in the crucible of necessity. The silence has been banished, not by a magical incantation or a feat of brute strength, but by the collective will of a people who remembered how to sing together. Kaelen and Lyra often stand on a high balcony overlooking the main concourse, watching the life they helped restore. They see apprentices of the Resonant Hearts Guild leading groups of young dwarves in listening exercises, their hands pressed to the walls to feel the mountain song. They hear smiths experimenting with new alloys, their hammers striking in rhythms that complement the great bell's foundational tone rather than fighting against it. The fear that once governed their elders has been replaced by a vibrant, curious energy, a shared understanding that their history is not a cage to be locked away, but a living language to be spoken and expanded upon. The work of restoration is continuous, a daily practice of tuning and attentiveness that every dwarf now sees as their personal responsibility. Yet, for all this vibrant activity, a quiet wisdom tempers their triumph. They know, with the certainty of those who have walked in the deepest dark, that not every hall will be reopened. Some chambers, too damaged by time or too steeped in the echoes of ancient grief, may forever keep their secrets. Some silences are too deep to be broken, and some scars on the mountain's heart are best left to heal in their own time. This is not a failure, but a sign of maturity. They have learned the difference between reckless meddling and respectful reclamation. Their quest was never to conquer the mountain, but to converse with it, to listen as much as they sought to be heard. And so, they look out over their home, side by side, their partnership, a quiet mirror of the harmony they helped create. The weight of expectation has eased, not because the work is done, but because it is now shared by all. They are guides, not saviors, teachers, not solitary heroes. The song of the dwarves is safe, because it is no longer held in a single bell or in the hands of two people. It lives in the voice of a child, learning an old rhyme, in the steady rhythm of a miner's pick that now swings in time with the mountain's pulse, in the careful hand of a lore keeper, copying a rune for a new generation. Their great work ensured that the song would never again depend on one thing, one place, or one person. It is a chorus now, vast and resilient, and as long as one dwarf remembers how to listen, and one heart remembers how to hope, that song will never, ever